is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene and Paul Sweeney.
Apple's still minting more money than God, right?
Geopolitics front and center for global Wall Street.
With Lisa Mateo on markets.
Stocks are coming off of another record high.
And Michael Barr with news.
U.S. Secretary of State discussed the conflict in Gaza.
The best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. This is Bloomberg Surveillance on Bloomberg Radio.
Good morning, everyone. Tom Keene, Paul Sweeney, Michael Barr, Lisa Mateo, various and sundry. Not in today because it's August 1.
Sure.
John Tucker joining us today, which is a good and wonderful thing. Thrilled to have him in here. News just coming out. The news flow, it's like they promised me it'd be like a summer week. No. Out moments ago, Bank of England and Governor Bailey, they cut their key interest rate 1/4 point to 5%. This is a huge deal for England with their political turmoil, with the banks studying the disparity, the polarity of the United Kingdom between a prosperous London and, as a generalization, everything else flat on their back. What I love about it, we'll talk to Anna Wong about this in a minute.
Oh, yeah.
BOE says 5 voted to cut rates. It's like a Supreme Court ruling.
I know.
4 said, are you kidding me? I went to Chicago. You're not cutting rates. That's basically what happened at the Bank of England. Anyways, we'll cover that. We have just an incredible show this morning. Paul, I've got a half hour with Richard Clarida in the 8 o'clock hour, the former Vice Chairman of the Fed. What do you see?
That's pretty solid right there. So we're going to check in. Anna Wong is going to be in studio, Tom, so that's pretty solid there. Rob Sotkin, global economist at Citi. He's going to discuss what central banks around the world are up to. Again, the Bank of England cutting rates, the Fed suggesting maybe September?
Suggesting.
So we'll leave it at that.
We'll leave it as a suggestion. Right now, from the Interactive Broker Studios, our Bloomberg Business Flash, John Tucker.
Yeah, BOE, first reduction since the early days of the pandemic, ends a year of borrowing costs at 5.25%. The initial reaction, we have sterling down about 0.7, 127.71 right now. Stocks in the U.S. did see that Fed-fueled surge. Powell signaling central bank on course to cut interest rates in September, sending stock and bond prices rallying. As we look at yields right now, the 2-year yield this morning up a basis point, 427. 10-year yield right now up just about 2 basis points, 4.04%. As I just had mentioned, Moderna falling after the company reducing its sales outlook for the year, expecting low uptake for the COVID shot in Europe. Biogen raising its profit outlook, cost cuts, faster sales of new drugs, boosting the second quarter earnings. And Meta, of course, after the close of regular trading yesterday, reporting better than expected sales for the second quarter. Also on the earnings call, Zuckerberg talked about Meta's push into the large language models that's going to power AI chatbots. Apple and Amazon, of course, report after the close of regular trading today. Dow futures right now up 29 points. S&P futures, they are 23 points higher, and the NASDAQ E-mini futures are 97 points higher. And we check the markets for you. Am I going too long? For you, all day long, right here on
As
Bloomberg
long as you
Radio.
want to go.
Lisa would have gone longer.
Oh, would she
But
have?
she's
Okay.
so charming, we don't give her grief.
Yeah.
You, on the other end, see ya.
She'll be
John
back
Tucker.
tomorrow.
John Tucker.
No,
or so
Monday,
she's-
pardon me.
John Tucker, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. He was generous to be with us yesterday for a lengthy conversation, a 2 short visit today with Ethan Bronner in Tel Aviv. Ethan, I looked up, is someone ignorant, the size of Hamas, and I was thunderstruck to see the number 40,000. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but with
It's
one
a widely used number, yeah.
with one death here, a death 3 weeks ago, how many Hamas leaders are out there for Israel to go after?
That's a good question. I mean, the announcement today was done a couple of weeks ago, as you said. I think that the situation is they need to get Yahya Sinwar, the main leader right now. That would truly break the organization in a substantial way. Until that happens, it's hard to imagine. And I think that they can replace them, and they do. I think the Politburo is kind of built with the understanding that people get killed along the way.
Ethan, what is the Israeli government, how are they positioning their efforts towards, again, prosecute a very aggressive war against Hamas, while also trying to move towards some type of agreement where they can get the hostages back? I mean, it just seems, I guess they have a dual track here, but what's the end game?
I mean, there's a right this minute, that there's not going to be any negotiating going on. Right this minute, what's happening is this country is bracing for an expected attack, an almost certain attack of some kind in the coming days. That Iran will be behind. It will probably come somewhere from Yemen, from the Houthis, and from Hezbollah, or from Iraq and Syria and the militias there. So it's almost certain. I mean, and look, in April, the Iranians sent 300 missiles and drones here, and the Americans and the French helped the Israelis stop them. And it was both real and an act of theater, and that may be what we're going to see here. That it's a sort of an effort to show, and not necessarily to start a real war, but who knows? To
partition the sadness of this, is this about a dome defense of high technology, or is this a defense against terrorism?
Well, you know, that's the thing, actually, that has been illustrated since October 7th, that Israel's high-tech air defenses turned out to not be sufficient for guys who have, store-bought drones and who dig tunnels and so on. So it turns out that Israel needs to adjust its defense doctrine, and it's in the process of doing so, including by building a larger army.
Ethan Bronner, thank you so much. Too short a visit, but exceptionally busy in Tel Aviv, our news bureau in Tel Aviv, with the leadership of Ethan Bronner. This is a joy, because if you're in Chicago, there's a rite of passage. It's 134 pages long. It's from the 20s, and you can't apply even if you don't read Frank Knight, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. Joining us on 90 and Uncertainty and what we witnessed yesterday, Anna Wong joins us, driving all of economics. I got 8 questions on unemployment, your incredibly nationally recognized discussion of birth-death model and that. But I want to talk about ambiguity within risk and uncertainty. What's the unknown you heard yesterday in that press conference?
I think the unknown between now and then is, will the stock market pull back that we saw for a couple of days last week? Will it turn into something bigger, which could lead to uncertainty fix?
You sound like Greenspan. Are you telling me that monetary economists are running policy off of the stock market?
Well, you heard Powell that the first part of the FOMC briefing is actually on the financial conditions of the economy.
Yeah.
So yesterday, what Powell did is that we'll see that yields are rallying, so that should loosen financial conditions. But between now and September, and even now to November, we're thinking about whether there will be a second rate cut, is whether the loosening in financial conditions would translate into higher core PCE inflation. We saw last December that the moment that Powell pivoted, the market rally, and then in January and February, inflation data was surprised on the upside, and that component, you can track it back to the stock market component. So so this is why, going back to the stock, what will the stock market do? Random walk, or is it with a drift, or is it going to continue climbing?
Could you see your work in institutional sales at Smith Barney
a
couple years ago? Yeah, it's a random walk, it's drift, should be thrown out of the room.
She can do anything she wants. So, Anna, I mean, there are a lot of folks out there, including a guest we're going to have coming up later, who's also Chicago trained, that feels like the Fed is already behind the curve, that inflation, if you look at the real-time data, it's tame. This economy is really slowing on the margins, and they're too late here. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I would agree on the whole that the Fed is late because the Fed has a dual mandate. But if the Fed only has an inflation target, then I don't think the Fed is late. And I think the reason why is, it's very interesting. Tom, you love history. So if you look at 200 years of inflation data, whenever an inflation shock happened, at the end of 2 years, whatever the inflation is settled at is about the end of the disinflation process. I think it's not just a statistical regularity, as they would say, but there's some mechanism driving it, which is that usually the base effects goes away, whatever.
So the x-axis on disinflation is 2-3 years, right?
Yes. Yeah,
okay. Where are we in that continuum right now?
We are at the end of that. So we are at, so whatever I think the core PCE inflation is at the end of this year is basically what the underlying is.
I got to go back in the time we've got left. Victory lap, folks, for Bloomberg Economics. Anna Wong, I'm serious here, folks. I make jokes about it. I mean, you should see her. She named her dog Microeconomics. What's that about? Dr. Wong, you set the tone nationwide for the discussion of the birth-death model, and you suggest our job numbers are over-optimistic. How much down do you bring non-farm payrolls when you adjust?
I think when you smooth over an entire year, currently the birth-death model is overstating non-farm payroll by about 400,000.
Wow.
Over the year?
For this year.
Divided by 10, even I can do that.
Yes.
40,000. So it's 40,000
Yes.
per month.
Yes.
So wow, what do we expect to see tomorrow in the labor market? I mean, do you feel like the labor market is still solid, or should we be concerned about a 4.1%?
Yeah, so tomorrow's number will be very tricky because over the reference period we had the Hurricane Beryl, which if it follows the similarity of Hurricane Irma from 17, then it should knock off about 30 to 40,000 non-farm payrolls from the non-farm payrolls. But at the same time, I think based on everything we see, without Beryl, I think non-farm payroll would be over 200,000 as well.
What's it like being in a class with Krosner? I mean, he's such a beast mathematically. Did you have to take Intro Math 101 to survive Randall Krosner?
I didn't take Randall Krosner, but everybody in Chicago is mathematical, and everybody had to do a math camp, a summer math camp.
You do a math camp?
Yes, before you start.
So you're top flight undergraduate, top flight masters, whatever, and you go. This is Paul. Did you go to math camp?
An intensive math camp.
I'm afraid.
8 weeks of intensity.
8 weeks?
Yes.
Oh my God.
With a slide rule?
With
a slide rule. That's what we used to use back when I was with Frank Knight and Milton. What's his name? What do you do at math camp at a PhD level?
You review all the, calculus, real analysis, statistical, metrics.
Now let's go. Can we go nerdy here? We got Clarida coming in the 8th hour. So Clarida, Gertler, Clarida. You take dynamic stochastic general equilibrium theory, DSGE. Basically, it's a straight line, folks, with a smooth curve that only Bernanke understands. Do you walk through the mathematics of DSGE in math camp?
That would be a little too early. We're just young chicken in math camp. But yeah, we do walk through it in the first year immediately. You jump right into
DSGE.
Yes.
And then do you hate Clarida when you do that?
Clarida is actually quite a mathematical person. The way he talks is very precise. I think in his mind, he's thinking mathematically about.
Do you want to come back in the 8 o'clock hour so you can ask the vice chairman some questions if you behave?
Sure, but
can you in the 8 o'clock hour come back?
Yeah.
Talk to Rich.
Should we do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it'd be like
If
a
Rich
Columbia.
says it's okay.
No, it'd be like a Columbia Chicago moment.
Oh,
you
boy.
got to be good. He's a former public official. We can't treat him like we treat you.
His nephew used to intern for me.
Clarida's nephew interned for you?
Yes.
Really? Did he go to Columbia?
No, at the Council of Economic Advisors in White
Oh,
House.
this is a White House job.
Wow.
Okay.
It all comes together, Tom.
Anna Wong, thank you so much. And for all of us at Bloomberg Surveillance, Team Surveillance, congratulations for moving the debate nationally on our labor economy. Anna Wong driving Bloomberg Economics, and we hope she'll join us here in the next hour with the former vice chairman of the Fed. Forget about that. Apple this afternoon.
Yes, exactly.
That's what matters.
How many iPhones are they selling here? Well,
That's really the question.
It's about how many iPhones are they
Why
selling.
would anyone buy an iPhone in this quarter?
Well, I'm buying one in September. I need a new one. Mine one's
Oh, no,
dying
but
as we
that's
speak.
what they're going to say in the conference.
Exactly.
See you in September. Stay with us. No singing forward. Good morning.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg News. And with this Bloomberg Business Flash, we're brought to you by IBKR. Financial advisors switch to Interactive Brokers for lowest cost global trading and turnkey custody solutions. No ticket charges, no conflicts of your interest at ibkr.com/RIA. Futures right now pointing to more gains this morning after that post-Fed rally yesterday. And overseas, Bank of England cutting interest rates 25 basis points to 5%, the first reduction since the early days of the pandemic. Pre-market right now shares of Meta Platforms close to 7% higher. eBay posting quarterly results exceeding analyst estimates. And Carvana shares rising as the online used car dealer reporting revenue for the second quarter that beat the average analyst estimate. Dow futures up 16 points. S&P E-mini futures, they're up 25. The Nasdaq E-mini futures up 113 points. And as Ferris Bueller said, if you have the means, I highly recommend it. Ferrari raising its guidance this morning. And we check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Tom.
Glad you put that in there. Ferrari's been a success. I don't know much about it, but is an auto company like making cars. It's been
an electric
plus.
Ferrari. That's the part I don't get because
you're driving an electric Hummer, so you know.
Well, no, the thing that's cool about the Ferrari is the
noise.
sound of
exactly.
that.
Well, they fake the noise. You have an electric Ferrari. they got fake noise as well. Hey, the Olympic coverage, and it just gets better and better. Thanks to Ian Bremmer for great photographs out on Twitter of the gorgeosity of the Olympics today. Our summer game updates, they are brought to you by State Street Global Advisors. Paul, I want to see the surfing.
Yes, from Tahiti, right?
From Tahiti.
Right.
I mean, I don't know
French
if it's
Polynesia.
on Peacock or it's on,
We'll find it.
I don't know.
And Colin Jost, from Saturday Night Live, is the commentator, the host, or whatever.
I'm not sure if that's real or that's kind of tongue-in-cheek.
Well, no, I don't think it is. But he got injured because he was out on the coral reef and stepped on those razor-sharp
it's really
corals.
bad. It's
so
not funny.
Cut his foot.
Yeah. We have a spectacular show. We had the best ever Fed program yesterday. Richard Clarida joining us in the 8 o'clock hour, the former vice chairman. We hope Dr. Wong can attend as well. Bill Dudley was with us yesterday. And what we saw were seismic moves in within a mundane press conference, the most fascinating new territory for our central bank. I should point out Bank of England cutting rates here 18 minutes ago. An extended conversation with Wei Li of BlackRock. Wei Li, let's just start with a why. Why do we see price up, yield down?
Well, from the Fed meeting yesterday, I think September is pretty much a done deal. The bar for not cutting is very high. So I think that's what markets got excited. But importantly, the way that Jay Powell framed the reasons for September cut is also why markets are happy with yesterday's meeting. He characterized what's happening in labor market as normalization rather than labor market weakening. And what is going to lead to a September cut that is looking very likely is more around better behaving inflation rather than weaker labor market. So I think that's a good combination for risk assets.
On a y-axis, it's logarithmic. You end up looking at a curve as convexity. Is there literally a short cover in bonds now? Is there literally an equity-like short cover where everybody goes, OMG, yields are going lower?
Well, if you look at the hedge fund positioning, absolutely. A lot of the speculative positions went from short bonds to long bonds. But I would observe that front end of the curve has done better than the back end of the curve. So mainly in response to kind of markets pricing in more cuts. But our concern for the back end of the curve, especially over a longer term horizon, still stays, which is a higher fiscal trajectory, higher term premium, which currently is still in the negative territory.
You know, you've got a great note out here, your weekly note, Wei Li, and I'm looking at your assets in review. One of the best performers is gold here. What do you make of that?
Well, I think if you look at what's been working so far this year as a diversifier is not your go-to good old duration in a portfolio, but rather some of the other assets such as gold, and on top of that, the negative correlation between gold and real rate has helped there as well. Now, having said that, it's really hard to kind of think about gold in the context of a longer term portfolio construction simply because there's no cash flow to discount future cash flow with. Now, having said that, there is a case to be made to allocate to gold in portfolio because of the characteristics that it has exhibited as you observed as well.
So, the central banks are certainly in focus yesterday with the Fed. Today with the Bank of England cutting interest rates. Traders believe that there'll be another rate cut in November. What do you make of the Bank of England?
Well, Bank of England is very interesting, right? So headline inflation is already at target, but core inflation, service inflation is still somewhat sticky. You can talk about some of the Taylor Swift effect and labor market wage as well. But broadly, we see better behaving inflation, and I think that's what gave the Bank of England comfort to cut rates. We think that there is more room for them to cut than the Fed because of a structurally weaker growth outlook, which is why we prefer gilts over treasuries.
Right. Wei Li, we want you to come back for the next segment. I really want to focus on Asia and China with your immense skill and heritage there. But I got to ask the question. You stumbled into it, and I hope that your badge works at BlackRock this morning. You mentioned gold without cash flows. That reminds me of Bitcoin. Is Bitcoin developing as a gold equivalent?
Well, what we have seen is that it has the ability to demonstrate a huge price appreciation, but also depreciation, right? So basically a lot of volatility. So I think a case can be made, a tactical case can be made for Bitcoin from a speculative kind of perspective, not unlike venture capital type of investment. But again, it's really hard to think about kind of the longer term allocation because there's no future cash flow to do.
There's no future cash flows. I don't know how she gets lunch at BlackRock with that because they're like me first into the ETFs. I'm busting your chops, Wei Li. I'm sorry. Wei Li, what's the character of this bull market we have? The rebound. NVIDIA has gone from a 104 to a 123. Is this an AI celebration?
Well, let's not forget the AI nervousness that characterized the few trading days before yesterday's meaningful rebound. So I think what we're experiencing right now is the cold feet that we're now used to before tech companies reporting earnings. This is the sixth quarter of ChatGPT era. And every quarter they come in, they beat, and markets kind of get reassured. Right. Similar to April, markets got nervous, and then the earnings were okay, and then we continue to go from strength to strength. I think this is what we're seeing right now. NVIDIA is not reporting until end of August, so I think there is still a lot of anxiety, but excitement as well.
Can the 10-year yield go under 4%? And how does our world change with a 398 10-year yield?
Well, I think 4%, 398, these are psychologically important levels, but we're talking about not far from where we are, right? So given how volatile rates have been, I think it's possible that it can break 4%, especially given the repricing momentum. Right. But I think the big picture here is important, which is number one, rates have been very volatile. Markets have been swinging from one narrative to the other narrative in very quick succession. So I think expect volatility. And number two, once we look through that volatility, we're still talking about higher than pre-pandemic rate levels because of structurally inflationary forces. Let's not forget that.
Let's come back. Wei Li with us with BlackRock, generous to be with us for a half hour. We will really focus there on China and what we see there in economic growth, but a number of other topics as well. Paul, an extraordinary show in the next hour, the former vice chairman of the Fed.
And get a sense of kind of where he sees this Federal Reserve. Again, as Wei Li was mentioning, market pricing in, pretty solid rate cut beginning in September.
He was forceful in his defense of Jerome Powell yesterday. Futures up 26, NASDAQ up 0.6%. VIX hasn't moved, 16.20. From New York City, Bloomberg surveillance.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Futures right now point to more gains. Fed Chair Powell signaling central bank on course to cut interest rates in September. Of course, that sent stocks rallying, bond prices higher yesterday. Meta, the pre-market right now 7.6% higher, reporting better than expected sales for the second quarter after the close yesterday. Apple and Amazon, they report later today. Moderna, also one of the standouts in the pre-market right now. mRNA, the ticker symbol, down over 10%. lowering their annual sales outlook. Most active this morning, shares of NVIDIA up 3%. Yesterday, we saw that 13% rally. Comes a day after the 7% rout. Slimming down, WW International, better known as Weight Watchers, laying off employees, cutting costs as it struggles to stay afloat. In this new era of obesity treatments, shares have lost about 90% of their value this year alone. S&P 500 futures, 26 points higher. They're up 0.5% at 55.84. The Dow futures, 18 points higher. And the NASDAQ E-mini futures are up 112 points. 2-year yield, 2 basis points higher. That's at 427. The 10-year yield, 2 basis points higher, 4.05%. We check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Tom.
John Tucker, thanks so much. With us, Wei Li of BlackRock, and of course, with all of her heritage from China, her ability to win their most prestigious mathematics event 2 years in a row, extraordinary. We're thrilled she could join us today. Wei Li, in 2015, I walked down the stairs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and there, in a phenomenal a show, China Through the Looking Glass, was one of the few extant 1960s Chinese military uniforms. I guess they're extremely rare. And it was from a China from another time and place. There's talk that President Xi wants to take elements of the Mao past and drag it forward. Do you see that in any way, that after the plenum, China wants to revert to a 60s, or dare I say, a 50s model?
Tom, it doesn't take a math Olympiad to see that growth in China is slowing down, right? You look at the latest Taixing PMI print that decreased versus the previous print, following disappointing Q2 growth number. To your point, plenum came and went, State Council came and went, and Politburo came and went, and they all paint a similar picture, which is that they would support growth in a kind of bite-sized fashion, including surprise rate cuts, but we're not talking about big bazooka, right? So yes, we're looking at maybe around 5% growth for this year, which is their target, but there is a huge amount of focus around medium-term reform, and that is a trade-off: medium-term progress versus the near-term growth, which is why we have a neutral allocation despite the appealing valuation opportunities in China.
From where you sit and the experts at BlackRock, I just don't want to put this on you, but do you see them going back to the standard formula of state enterprises as being the solution, manufacturing, industrial production, or can they actually jumpstart and make permanent a consumer revolution?
Well, consumer savings rate is one of the reasons why they need to support near-term growth, because coming out of the pandemic, consumers have not really boosted growth the way that US consumers have and European consumers have. And this is really in the context of high youth unemployment rate, in the context of aging population, in the context of still lingering deflationary fear. So consumers are not really kind of picking up the baton, so to speak. And we have seen manufacturing side of things having to do more heavy lifting. So indeed, I think we need to really kind of think about how far consumers can support the economy. And this is also why over the longer term, we're looking at Chinese growth with a 3 handle by the end of the decade because of the structural headwinds that I just talked about.
So, it seems like their policy here of isolating themselves, whether it's from a technology perspective or just an overall economic perspective, whether it be in the context of U.S. tariffs, European tariffs, I just don't see how the Chinese government feels like that is a viable long-term strategy. It would seem like they would want to integrate with the global economy, not isolate themselves. Is that part of your neutral call?
This is actually one of our mega forces that BlackRock has identified: geopolitical fragmentation. Isolationist policies are possible, not just in China, but you look at what's happening globally, you look at what could happen in the US as well. And this is why we're looking at an environment where spheres of influences are moving further apart, fragmentation of supply chains creating inflationary pressure. This is also why, even though we have had the last quarter of inflation better behaving, downside surprises, we think inflation is likely going to actually settle at a higher level compared to before because of frictions coming from isolationism, coming from the fragmentation of supply chain, duplication of supply chain. So really, inflation protecting portfolios is what we're thinking about for strategic asset allocation.
Again, Wei Li, and not to pin it just on you, but the greatest thinkers at BlackRock globally, and I know you've got a huge Asian presence. You just set a 3 handle on a run rate of China growth, I believe. What does that do to Vietnam? Frankly, what does that do to Japan? That's an entirely new Asian regime, isn't it?
Well, what we have seen is whilst the exports from China to the US has decreased, the export from Mexico, for example, to the US have overtaken that from China. So I think there is a restructuring of supply chain and trade relationships that is happening. It takes time, but it is happening. So likes of Vietnam you talked about, but India, and also Middle East and Mexico, for that matter, are likely going to benefit as we think about this fragmentation of geopolitical relationships and fragmentation of supply chains, but elevating on a higher level. So that's one of the mega forces. Other mega forces like aging population also benefit these countries that I just talked about. So really think about international diversification as we think about portfolio construction in the context of everything that we just touched.
Wei Li, I see in the BlackRock research, you guys are overweight Japan. And that's something I haven't heard in a long time.
Yes, we have been overweight Japan for quite a long time. Now we prefer Japanese equities over JGB, Japanese government bonds. What we have seen this week is Bank of Japan indicating that they are likely going to move faster on the path of normalization. And this is important because the destination hasn't changed. It's the speed of normalization that seems to be faster. But my most important takeaway from the BOJ this week is that the backstop is still in place. If data does not give them comfort to move fast, they would slow down. So that's important as we think about the Japan call, but certainly risks have increased because of the faster pace of normalization. I would note though, US dollar, Japanese equities is just 1% lower compared to the peak. So we like Japan on a currency hedged basis for that reason.
This has been wonderful. Wei Li, thank you so much, particularly in the comments on China. We have to go now to a huge story for journalism in America. The Moscow Times in the last 16 hours says Russia may free 20 to 30 political prisoners in historic exchange with West. That has occurred. Bloomberg reports that Wall Street Journal reporter has been released by Russia in a multi-country prisoner swap. Roz Matheson, driving all of our government reporting, joins us now. Roz, a number of weeks ago, the reporter from the Journal found guilty, and that sets up the prisoner swap. Were we surprised how rapidly this occurred?
A little bit surprised by how rapidly it occurred, but also surprised, I guess, by the size of what is happening.
Yeah.
What we know so far, as you said, is that Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter, has been freed, as has the former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan, of course, who's been sitting in jail since 2018 and convicted on spying charges that he denies. So we know those two are part of the package. We know there's a multi-person swap negotiated over months, you'd have to imagine, because it involves a bunch of countries, a bunch of people on either side. big questions, of course, about who Russia is getting in return for all of this, for releasing Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan. So this is obviously something that's been carefully negotiated over a many period of months, but they obviously were anticipating, of course, that Evan Gershkovich was going to be found guilty and was going to be jailed in Russia.
Do you understand within your reporting and with Henry Winter's leadership in Moscow, do you understand, Roz Matheson, that this is a strategy by Russia to go around and pick up Westerners for whatever reason, including Evan with the Wall Street Journal, so that they can get back more valuable espionage-like people in a prisoner swap?
Well, we've seen this as a pattern, because we had the WNBA star Brittany Griner, who was put in jail for 9 months on a fairly minor thing involving cannabis oil, and she was used as leverage, really, for Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, to get the arms dealer Viktor Bout back. So this is obviously a pattern where they can use, fairly ordinary U.S. citizens, sports stars, reporters, but use those as leverage to get some quite serious characters back in return. And again, the real question here also in, the important news that Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan have been freed is who's going back the other way.
Roz, is there any notable aspects as to the timing? Why did this happen now?
Well, it sounds like it has, again, been going on for months. So this is not something that just started a couple of weeks ago, but with the view, no doubt, that Evan Gershkovich was likely to end up facing a long prison term. And so I guess also the U.S. administration is keen to get this sorted before Joe Biden's administration ends its term at the end of the year. They've been pressing hard on this, though, for many months. And a key character on the Russian side, of course, has been in frame for quite some time, and that's Vadim Krasikov, who's sitting in a German jail for the 2019 killing of a Chechen separatist in a Berlin park. And Putin has said publicly many, many times he wants Krasikov back. And Germany had said no because he's convicted of a crime in Germany. And so perhaps this was just a moment where all the stars aligned in terms of Putin getting what he wants out of it. Again, we don't know exactly who's going back the other way, and for the US to get Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan in return. And there are plenty of other names in the mix, it seems. We don't know, again, a lot of the details, but we know this is a multi-person swap.
If you're just joining us across the nation and worldwide, Bloomberg surveillance this morning, an exceptionally busy August 1st. Our Jennifer Jacobs reports that U.S. reporter Evan Gershkovich of the Wall Street Journal and former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan, they have been in a prisoner swap, and as Roz Matheson says, of a far larger size than was expected, a week or two ago. It's a very short story, but a very powerful story for both sides. Paul Sweeney, why don't you continue with Roz?
So, Roz, again, how does this come about here? Is this driven by the White House? Is this driven by the State Department? Who kind of leads these discussions, which, again, don't seem to be one-offs? They seem to be, as you mentioned, part of a pattern here.
Well, they are driven to some extent by the State Department, but also at the very highest level. And this is actually one area where, despite Russia's war in Ukraine and the broader tensions with Russia, that we've seen there'd be a little bit of a room to discuss prisoner swaps, both for Ukraine and Russia, but also Russia and the US. This is one avenue, one conduit, one discussion point that has remained open throughout. And we have seen some of those prisoner swaps occur already in recent years, as mentioned, most notably with Brittany Griner. But it's clear that this is something where Putin feels that he has something to gain. And he only negotiates when he feels he has something to gain. And so that's why these doors have remained open. But you can imagine there has been months and months of very careful and delicate and tricky negotiations that have gone on, largely involving the State Department, but also other aspects of the U.S. administration to get this over the line.
Roz Matheson, thank you so much from London, driving all of our government coverage. Joining us now from the Taubman Center, Brown University, Wendy Schiller, not on the American election, but on a prisoner swap. Wendy Schiller, there's a various and sundry Tom Hanks movie where there's a bridge, I'll say in East Germany, I can't remember where, and there's a prisoner swap of one person for another, or it's a John le Carré novel. You know the drill. This is not like this. This seems to be an organized effort by Russia to grab a reporter with no espionage past, or Paul Whelan, a Marine who went over to Russia to go to a wedding and picking him up. Is this just Putin and the Russians using us to effect a prisoner swap for their valued espionage material?
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, I think, Tom, that's a good instinct. But it's also a signal to journalism, right? A signal internally to Russia. They've always cracked down. We see all countries all over the world doing the same thing. And it's a message not only to internal Russian journalists, but international journalists. Don't come into my sandbox. Don't give me negative reporting. I'm going to shut the doors on that. And he did, and he arrested him and held him. And thankfully now he'll be released, or he's already been released. But this is just a signal that says, I'm going to do what I want to do in my country. And if you are going to try to report on it, I'm going to shut the door on you.
Wendy, what will the Biden administration do with this news here? Will they take credit for it? Will they just stay on the sidelines? How do you think they're going to play it?
I think that, if Biden were still running, he would make an argument that engagement and diplomacy and conversation, even with people who are perceived to be our enemies, is always important in the world order. That's an argument he would have made, and he would have had, 50 years to back that up. Does Kamala Harris take that on? Probably not right now. It's not been her theme, but certainly credits the idea of engagement when Donald Trump's position and his party's position veers towards isolationism. So the argument is, if you stop talking to people, then you can't get anything done in the world order.
Wendy, with all that's gone on here, the center tendency for Americans has been a journalist and a Marine at a wedding over in Russia. From where you sit with decades of experience, is it safe for anyone to travel to Russia?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the United States has to really rethink its warning policies. They are pretty proactive about it. But, I mean, you could make the same argument, Tom, even to go to many parts of the world that we thought we could go to, like Venezuela or Israel. Or right now, the world is in great turmoil. And you can argue that nations or individual actors and non-state actors act with impunity against Americans in a way that you could say maybe 30, 40 years ago they did not. And that's where Donald Trump comes in to argue that if he's president, they're going to stop doing that he's going to instill fear in those actors, and the Americans will be better protected. So it's kind of a double-edged theme that Donald Trump's trying to sell the American people about how he'd be president. And I think Kamala Harris is going to have to address these sorts of issues as she continues in her campaign.
What does it say about Mr. Putin here? Is this just part of his, toolbox of, international diplomacy, a little bit of a terror edge to it?
Well, politics is all about uncertainty, and I'm going to leave it to your excellent Russia reporters and experts here. But, it used to be 2 weeks ago that maybe Trump was going to win, and he was going to win relatively easily. Now, we don't know who's going to win the American election, and Putin, no matter what he does, still has to deal as president of the United States. So in this sense, he's hedging his bets, right? So if he doesn't want to risk being completely demonized, shut out, having any negotiating power with Kamala Harris, let's say, and this is just something that just happened. So I don't think it's coincidental that it culminated now. And also you see in Ukraine, there's a sort of a weakening to, keep going and going and going. And maybe there's some sort of, peace that can be established, but Russia will walk away with some territory. So it's pretty good timing on the part of Putin right now.
Wendy, thank you so much. On short notice, from Brown University, Wendy Schiller here. Again, Jennifer Jacobs reporting for Bloomberg that Russia is releasing Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan. And this is, again, a major prisoner swap. The Moscow Times had this 18 hours ago as being 20 and even 30 people. We'll have much more detail on that. Certainly something that we will follow through the day here at Bloomberg. And thank you, Rosalind Matheson, for joining us, driving all of our economic coverage. Scheduled, and we have a good amount of time here right now, is Joumanna Bercetche. We are thrilled that she's in Dubai driving all of our Middle Eastern coverage with the leadership of Horizon and her program there, but far more the spirit of speaking to people across the Middle East. And we speak now with Joumanna about her Lebanon and about what we see in Israel and such. Joumanna, first of all, to your many, many contacts in Lebanon, the tension north of Israel right now, the tension in Lebanon, give us a description of that.
It's difficult to describe. I guess my size speaks for itself. But overall, tension is possibly the highest it has been in the last couple of decades. This is an extremely fraught moment for the Middle East, given the events over the last couple of days and the various fronts that are opening up, not just within Gaza, but of course now you have a new potential active front in Lebanon after the Beirut strike that took out the right-hand man of the Hezbollah leader a couple of days ago. You have a potentially new front opening up in Iran after the airstrike in Tehran, the same night as the Beirut airstrike. And then, of course, you have the ongoing Houthi attacks on the vessels. Let's not forget about those as well. So you've got multi-dimensional hotspots opening up around the region, and there is serious concern that there is a potential slippage. One miscalculation could have this thing really blow up and end up in a scenario where all sides ends up regretting.
On your reporting on Horizon, as you speak to Emirati leadership, and for that matter, Arab leadership of the Levant, who are they supporting? Who are they focused on here among the various parties?
Interesting you raise that, Tom, because it's very nuanced depending on which country you speak to in the region. Now, don't forget that many of the Gulf countries actually did sign an Abraham Accords, a normalization agreement with Israel back in 2020 that includes the UAE, that includes Bahrain, it also includes Morocco as well. So they've been treading very carefully on the subject of the war in Gaza. Of course, Saudi Arabia as well have been playing a very fine line diplomatically because, as we've been reporting over the last few months, they have been working very closely on a normalization deal that would coincide with the defense deal with the U.S. as well. So they don't want to give up on that. But what the Saudis told us is that essentially they can't push forward with the normalization deal while there are still boots on the ground in Gaza. Other countries, you look at the likes of Egypt and Qatar, well, their role throughout all of this has been to play the role of the mediator to push forward these ceasefire discussions. And I thought it was really telling yesterday that the Prime Minister of Qatar, who also serves as their foreign minister, put out a tweet right after the killing of Ismail Haniyeh saying that it is very difficult to push forward with these negotiations if one of the sides of the negotiators has been assassinated. So I think there's a lot of pessimism now about the future of these ceasefire talks.
And Joumanna, you mentioned, some of the countries, Egypt, Qatar, that are trying to act as mediators, but it appears at this point that Israel has had no interest in pursuing peace or at this moment, even, thinking about their relations with the U.S. Is that a concern in your part of the world?
It's definitely a concern. I think there are many analysts out there who are questioning the full faith of the Israeli government to actually engage in these ceasefire discussions. We know that there have been many diplomatic attempts to push forward with the discussions. Even Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been in Asia this past week, and he gave some comments in Malaysia overnight saying the path that the region is on is towards more conflict. It has to make the right choices in the day ahead because those choices are the difference between staying on this path of violence, of insecurity, of suffering, or moving on to something very different and much better. So the U.S. are still trying very hard to push forward with these discussions. France, Germany are other countries looking to get involved as well. And the feedback from the Qataris is, even though they're pessimistic, they still want to push on. But the other question is, who is going to be representing Hamas? Because two of the most senior figures have been eliminated in the last 2 days.
Joumanna, I got 1 minute left, and I just want to take advantage of your encyclopedic knowledge of Lebanon. I get out a map like an ugly American, and I'm shocked that Haifa is 60, 70 miles from Beirut. The distances, folks, are so short. How far do you perceive that Israel would move north across the Lebanese border? Is it 1 or 2 miles like Syria and Turkey, or do they move into the suburbs of Beirut?
So the short answer is there was a war in 2006, 11 and 2006, a July war. And on the back of that, it was a very costly war for both sides. A resolution was put in place called Resolution 1701, which dictated that Hezbollah has to move about 30 kilometers away from the southern border north of the Litani River and give up its arms. Obviously, the resolution hasn't been implemented, but the analysts within the community will say Israel are not going to stop until 1701 is implemented. And even the prime minister, the Lebanese prime minister, is saying it's time for 1701 to be implemented. So they just want to push back Hezbollah.
Do you see how Joumanna does that? She stays in kilometers. You know, we're nationwide in America. I think my math is the American hack is 18 miles is what we were translating there. Lost in translation, Joumanna Bercetche, thank you so much, particularly for those comments on your Lebanon. She, of course, delivers Horizon each and every day in Dubai. Quiet morning, Paul.
No, jeez. Yeah, exactly right. So, news coming across fast and furious. And again, the market's looking a little bit higher here. We had that strong trade off of the Fed meeting yesterday and the Fed press conference. I think most of the market kind of said, all right, this Federal Reserve is really trying to position itself for a September rate cut. And that's what we saw in the market action yesterday. Got a little bit of green on the screen here this morning, Tom.
The markets are there and the tech earnings are there. Again, the Bloomberg article and the headlines from Bloomberg. It was interesting to see the Journal pick those up. Thank you to the Wall Street Journal, as they have stayed on this story for well in excess of a year.
Unbelievable. Front page every day.
Jennifer Jacobs reporting Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan released by Russia in multi-country prisoner swap. We'll have that balance of power, of course. We'll focus on that. Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines here later today. It is such a treat. Yesterday on the Fed Decides, the former vice chairman of the Fed, in the 8 o'clock hour, Richard Clarida again. Bloomberg Surveillance, good morning.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene and Paul Sweeney.
Why are we upset if we're creating jobs?
Inflation is still a thing out there for the everyday consumer.
With Lisa Mateo on markets.
The economic calendar jam-packed today.
And Michael Barr with news.
Tensions between the U.S. and China have heated up even more.
The best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. This is Bloomberg Surveillance on Bloomberg Radio.
Good morning, everyone. Paul Sweeney, Tom Keene, Michael Barr, Lisa Mateo, John Tucker with us as well. And the busiest week of the summer, no question about that. Red and green on the screen, but huge market moves off the Fed meeting yesterday. Yields lower as well. We've got a packed hour for you. The former vice chairman of the Fed, Richard Clarida, to join us here in moments from the Pacific Investment Management Company, a special treat. Anna Wong will come in to ask smarter questions than me to Professor Clarida. Just lots going on here. And of course, a major breaking story we'll get to in moments. Jennifer Jacobs reports that there has been a multi-country prisoner swap between the United States of America and Russia. Let's get right to it. We're from the Interactive Broker Studios. Our Bloomberg Business Flash, John Tucker.
All right, futures after yesterday's rally right now indicate a mixed open on Wall Street. Meta platform sales, the beat there, adding fuel to the rebound for technology companies. For tech stocks, investors going to be watching earnings from Amazon after the close for further clues about the returns from investments in AI. A report from Apple probably going to give indicators of how the iPhone 16 expected to perform in September. Right now, the Dow futures down 9, S&P E-mini futures 18 points higher. The NASDAQ futures 65 points higher. 2-year yield, that's up right now, up 3 basis points, 292. And the 10-year yield, 3 basis points higher. That is at 4.06%. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash, Paul and Tom.
Thanks so much, John Tucker. The essay that's out from the State Department is short and to the point. The Telegraph is as abrupt in London as Jennifer Jacobs' report from Bloomberg here on the United States and its allies involved with the prisoner swap with Russia. One of our best people on this, now in Dubai, not Moscow, Greg Sullivan joins us now on Russia economics and, of course, this political news as well. Greg, was this expected?
Well, there were certain indications that something was afoot. And then, as you said, we recently learned, people familiar with the situation have told us that there indeed has been a swap. And among those that were swapped were Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan. There may be others. We've been told this is a big swap, but details are still forthcoming on that.
Greg, Tom has been kind of asking the question here this morning. I'll follow up. Is this becoming a strategy of Mr. Vladimir Putin in terms of picking random Westerners off the streets in Russia and then swapping them for valuable assets in the West?
Well, certainly there have been those that have accused him of just that, and certain Western officials have levied that criticism. It's very clear that that there have been an uptick in arrests of Americans, and we've seen over the past couple of years some high-profile swaps. So that accusation has been leveled. Moscow has denied it. But clearly, we expect that there will be Russians released. There have been Russians that Putin has eyed and has almost very clearly indicated that he would like to see released. So it does appear to be somewhat of a strategy on his part.
So, Greg, in the world of global journalism, how do you and your Western counterparts cover Russia?
Well, it's certainly gotten difficult not being on the ground, but there still are ways to do it. It is an increasingly hard country to cover, and as we've seen, a dangerous country to cover, with Evan Gershkovich being a case in point. U.S. officials have determined that he was wrongly detained. His newspaper has said that he was just doing his job in journalism when he was arrested. So it is a dangerous and complex country to cover, but there are ways, and we keep trying.
Greg from Dubai, Greg Sullivan, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. And again, we'll revisit this through the morning. We're trying to track down David Gura right now with his abilities as well. This is a joy, and it goes way back, and it was wonderful yesterday to talk to Richard Clarida and put him in an incredibly uncomfortable position. We had the senator from Massachusetts talking about the unfairness of Richard Clarida's central bank. And of course, I asked him about the Gilded Age, and we went back 120 years, and he sidestepped it in the best Greenspanian fashion I could ever see. For some reason, Richard Clarida comes back for more this morning. Thank you so much for joining Bloomberg this morning.
As always, thanks for having me.
What changed yesterday? The fact, and I understand there's some geopolitical yield going on there as well, but we had fixed income up, yield down, equities to the moon. What was the Fed signaling that gave markets confidence?
I think a couple things. First of all, one could argue that, if anything, the FOMC statement itself maybe was a little bit less dovish than folks might have thought. But yet again, the press conference, I think a fair reading of the press conference was that it skewed a bit dovish. Now, again, the move in prices was quite small. The September cut was fully priced in before the meeting. It's fully priced in after the meeting. But this is a committee that cares about both sides of the dual mandate. They've made that clear now in the statement, and they also made clear they're getting increasing confidence that inflation's on a path to 2, and finally that they actually discussed at the meeting yesterday cutting rates at the meeting yesterday. So all in, I think that's what the markets were reacting to, Tom.
Richard, there are folks in academia and in practice in the marketplace that feel like the Fed is already behind the curve, that the real-time data suggests that the economy really is slowing, and by the time they get cutting rates, it may be too late. How do you respond to that?
Well, good question, because I think that is a risk they have been willing to take for a couple of years. Indeed, Chair Powell made that very clear at Jackson Hole in 2022. As inflation has moved towards target from above, they've increasingly, and yesterday in the statement, indicated that they now are looking at both sides of the dual mandate. That said, I agree with them. I think the data coming in are certainly consistent with an economy operating at or perhaps a bit above trend. So I don't think they're in a danger zone here of falling behind the curve. Moreover, they've made very clear that if they do see any softening in the labor market, it looks like they won't hesitate to start cutting. So there's risk management here, agree, but I think they're in a good place.
You undersell this. You got to get some PR. Richard
Okay.
Clarida. Basically, Richard Clarida made modern Columbia economics. He took the heritage of a guy named Stiglitz, a heritage of a guy named Phelps. There was some guy doing fancy math at Princeton. He said, "Come on up to Columbia." And what's amazing about this is you even teach microeconomics at Columbia still, like Pierre-Andre Chiappori. I mean, you got Mike. Well, how does microeconomics fit in at Columbia, unlike the madness at Chicago?
Well, I work in some micro in my classes. I think it's best for all concerned that I stick to the macro. You also mentioned Bob Mundell, who passed away not too long ago.
Yes.
A dear friend and colleague. So at one point, I think we had four Nobel laureates on the faculty. So, yeah.
Let's bring in our Nobel laureate, Anna Wong, with a question for the former vice chairman, Anna Wong of Chicago in Bloomberg Economics.
Yeah, Rich, you mentioned that this committee is one that's very focused on both sides of the mandate. And do you think that going forward, suppose that we do have the Trump #2 administration with what's happening with the potentially higher tariffs, would that factor into the committee's September meeting deliberations or even November deliberations? Should they do preemptive?
Should we just leave the studio right now, Paul?
Exactly.
That was a totally unfair question, Anna. Rich?
Well, first of all, Anna, as you know, I'm a big fan of your work, so keep up the good work. I think Jay Powell made it very clear yesterday. He got a couple of questions. And he said, look, we're going to base policy on achieving our mandate. I think he mentioned he'd been at the Fed for now 4 presidential election cycles. So I don't think it will be a factor. And I'm actually glad they clarified that, because there had been some meme in the markets that the Powell Fed might hold off doing anything to see how the election turned out. And I think clearly he set that aside.
And this was really something. His voice changed. His voice. I'm
noticed it.
sorry. This happens like Mankiw when he was at the White House. He'd get upset, and all of a sudden he'd go into Harvard lecture form when he got upset. Bernanke used to do the same thing. Anna, ask another question to make us look puny, please.
Yeah, I want to push on that point a little bit, Rich. You were there during the Trump first trade war, as was I.
Yeah.
You understand, you were briefed about the inflationary impact of the first trade war, and you probably remember that the briefing was tilting toward saying that the tariffs were inflationary, which didn't turn out to be.
Yeah.
And right now, the mainstream economists, Wall Street economists, are uniformly saying that it will be very inflationary again. What's your thought on that?
Well, there are a couple of things. First, if anything, during my time at the Fed before the pandemic, inflation was running a little bit low. The main thing that emerged at that point in 2019 was that the trade war, concerns about the trade war, were very negative on economic activity and sentiment. I do think the details will be important. I think that in particular, there would be an inclination, depending on how they're structured, if there were tariffs, to try to distinguish between if it's moving up the price level like a value-added tax, whereas it's inflationary. But I think the key thing for your listeners to bear in mind is that's a decision the Powell Fed does not have to make now. They made it very clear. 2024 rate decisions are based on 2024 data and outlook. They'll have plenty of time to reassess and think about this as they go into 2025. So, good question, but I don't think it'll be a factor now.
You defended William McChesney Martin. Paul, one more question in this section with Rich Clarida.
All right, let's assume the Fed starts cutting in September. Then what? How do they prosecute this policy to get rates down? Is it every other meeting? How does that work?
Well, the trite answer is it's data dependent, but I think they've acknowledged that if they cut once, they will be thinking there's more than one cut. We'll get good information on that in the projections. We'll get another set of projections in December. Here's what I think. I think there are basically a couple scenarios. One is a very, very soft landing, in the spirit of the Olympics, sticking the soft landing. In that case, the economy just chugs along a trend. Unemployment doesn't go up. Inflation moves gradually down to 2, and then they can gradually cut rates as inflation falls. Another scenario is the economy slows more sharply, and then I think they can cut more rapidly. I do think the bar right now is pretty high to hike rates, and so I think if the economy gets stuck at inflation at current levels, they may not cut very many times and keep rates at an elevated level. But importantly, it could depend on the outcome of the election. But again, we won't know how that plays out until 2025. So,
Richard Clarida, please stay with us.
Yeah.
We've got so much to talk about. I'm going to look it up right now. You can do this on the Bloomberg Professional Service. The FOMC meetings, Paul, there it is, January 29th, after the inauguration.
Okay.
That'll be the meeting. Put that on your calendar, Dr. Clarida. We're going to have you back there January at 29. Anna Wong, thank you so much for joining us with Bloomberg Economics. Important questions, tough questions on politics.
Bringing it.
She can ask, we can't answer weird questions.
It was Chicago against Harvard there. That's kind of what I was saying.
It's different. There's a different oxygen out there. And
Exactly.
we can talk to Rich. We'll come back and talk to Rich Clarida about Knightian uncertainty. He knows I'm death on Bayesian dynamics.
Oh, who isn't?
I mean,
Come on.
We'll have to see. There's huge news flow today. We've been remiss. There are technology earnings this afternoon. We had markets green on the screen, now red and green on the screen as well. But we have exceptional political news this morning. Our Jennifer Jacobs reporting within the hour that we see a prisoner swap of the United States and allies with Russia, and we'll get much more on that. That news is really coming off a single State Department directive, and we'll have much more on this coming up. And this involves two key Americans. Futures up 22 from New York City with Rich Clarida, Bloomberg Surveillance.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. The major indexes after yesterday's rally right now indicate a mixed cash open on Wall Street. The S&P 500 jumping 1.6% yesterday for the best day since February. Treasury yields eased in the bond market after the Fed give the clearest indication yet it could start lowering interest rates in September. A little later this morning, in less than 15 minutes, we're going to get a read on jobless claims. July's unemployment print tomorrow. That's going to provide further clues of the state of the U.S. labor market. Meta Platforms among the most actively traded this morning. Sales beating, adding the sales beat there, adding fuel to the rebound for tech companies. For the technology stocks, investors are going to be watching also earnings from Amazon after the close for further clues about the returns from investments on AI. And then that report from Apple will give indications of how the iPhone 16 is expected to perform in September. Dow futures right now, they've just turned higher, up 7 points. S&P E-mini futures up 25. The NASDAQ futures right now, 102 points higher. The 2s and 10s, both 3 basis points higher. The 10-year at 4.06%, 2-year at 4.29. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Tom.
John Tucker, thanks so much. The Olympics are occurring, and they are magnificent. The Summer Games are updates. Our Summer Games updates, they're brought to you by State Street Global Advisors. It has been a blur of a morning. Thank you for joining us across the nation on YouTube, Apple CarPlay, on Android Auto. What a joy to have Anna Wong with us from Chicago and Bloomberg Economics. And we continue with the former Vice Chairman of the Federal Reserve System, Richard Clarida, this morning. Richard, you and I could turn this into a 3-hour love fest. We don't have the time to do that. So I'm just going to cut to the chase. I was busting Anna Wong's chops about Frank Knight, 1921, 134 pages. It's a rite of passage. And it's where we really began to think in the modern era of the unknown unknowns, the idea of what's the mystery that's out there. We have a pandemic overlay we're coming out of. We have an immigration dynamic we don't understand, on the edge of Angus Deaton. There's too many mysteries out. Productivity is a mystery we have. What is Richard Clarida's unknown if you were to sit down with the chairman this morning?
Well, those three would certainly be on the list. I think that an additional known unknown is the global fiscal outlook is terrible. 20 years ago, debt to GDP ratio was 40%. It's north of 100 now. Debt service costs exceed the defense budget in the U.S. And so everyone acknowledges that global fiscal paths are unsustainable, but there's no political will. So I think that the known unknown is when and what brings about the ultimate adjustment in fiscal policy, because it will happen eventually. I don't know if it's next year or in 10 years, but I think to me that's the known unknown.
And, I'm of a certain vintage. I've heard that my entire life.
Yeah?
We've had this little clock down in Lower Manhattan that ticks up the debt. I remember that as a kid driving up the east, the east side. And where will we see that, the concerns about global debt?
Yeah. So, excellent point, because why has it fallen? Why have the bond market vigilantes been in hibernation? Some would say they're extinct. And the simplest answer is because global interest rates have fallen by more than debt has gone up. So until recently, it seemed like a free lunch to politicians. Borrow, but your debt service costs go down because interest rates are falling. And so the point is, going forward, interest rates are not going to be as low as they were in the prior 20 years. And so the cost of that debt service will be more evident. And so at some point, that will drive a political outcome. But I do agree with you. The can has been kicked down the road for a long time, and it may be a while. But to me, that's a known unknown.
And what is the fix ultimately from an economic fiscal perspective?
It depends on the country, but the usual, if your deficits are too large and your debt service costs are too high, there's going to be some combination of adjustments on revenues and adjustments on outlays. But neither party is running on a platform to address that, and so I think it will not really be an issue in the campaign.
Wei Li was with us last hour, stunning us with a potential 3 handle on China GDP growth. Yeah. I want to go to a guy named Stiglitz, who way back at Stanford started to think about the little g of the growth rate. Olivier Blanchard and Stiglitz have really focused on the fact the global little g growth rate is better than good to sustain our fiscal policy. Do you suggest that we could see a diminished global growth rate that finally upsets the apple cart?
It could be growth, or it could happen through the interest rate channel. Remember, Olivier's famous equation is it's about R minus G. And so if G falls or R goes up...
Can you call Stockholm after the show and say, can we get a shingle out for Blanchard on R minus G? Give it to Williams as well.
Okay, exactly. Yeah.
So what do we do when we have too small a g on R minus G?
Well, exactly. And so if you have too small a g, then it brings forward the day of reckoning on fiscal adjustment. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, he's being careful, but this is real. Because Italy, there was with their demographics, it was like overdone, small g's done. And with the revolution of their politics, they've got actually very good g, because you're spending money in that little quarter in Venice buying lots of stuff.
Buying stuff,
Little g matters in Italy.
How about in China, though? I mean, how big of a concern is that for the global economy? Because I'll look at just something like their population. I mean, it's just aging, and it's aging at a much higher rate than a lot of other populations. I don't see that changing. So what does that mean for global growth?
Well, obviously, China's global growth has been slowing. We all remember when the number was 7 or 8, then it was 5 or 6, and now it's 4 or 5. So it's a very big economy. So 4.5% growth in China is still a big part of the global outlook. I think the real difference, though, compared to the past 20 years, is the way in which the Chinese economy interacts with the rest of the global economy. Commodity prices, activity. I think everyone agrees the big era of global hyper-globalization is over. And so the way in which Chinese growth drives the rest of the economy, I think, is changing. And it's actually something we're looking at closely at PIMCO.
We mentioned this yesterday. I busted your chops about Lawrence Meyer. Paulie wrote a little small book about the Greenspan Fed, where it was Alan Greenspan and everybody follow. I'm sorry, Hugh Pill, Jonathan Haskell,
I was going to bring that up.
Megan Green, and there's that troublemaker, Catherine Mann, dissenting at BOE.
Hugh Pill is the chief
economist. He went against the governor. Why can't your Fed be as normal and human as Catherine Mann's Bank of England?
Well, I will say that the Bank of England, certainly beginning with my good friend and mentor Mervyn King 30 plus years ago, it was a point of pride that their culture did not discourage dissents. And indeed, I think there was 1 or 2 meetings when Mervyn was outvoted, In this case, it was 5-4. But when the chief economist votes, it definitely gets the headline. Sure, there are dissents at the Fed. During my time, we had several meetings where there were 3 dissents. But it is the case that in the post-Greenspanian era that you refer to, or Greenspan and then post-Greenspan, dissents among governors have been pretty rare on monetary policy, and that's an entire another show. I won't spend time talking about why that is.
You're going to come back tomorrow.
Okay.
Rich Clarida, thank you so much. For John Farrell, Lisa Browitz, and myself yesterday, the Fed decides, for Paul Sweeney and all. This has just been very generous of you at this key time for our monetary policy. What are they going to do at the next meeting?
They're going to cut rates.
There you go.
There you go. That's all we need.
We'll leave it there. Eric, be sure that gets on single best idea. Rich Clarida of PIMCO, of Columbia, and of our Fed, thank you so much. Futures up 30, green. Clarida lifted the market.
Sure.
We had running green in the screen.
Yeah, green
single-handedly lifted the market. Paul, NASDAQ up 0.6%.
Exactly. We're going to get some more tech earnings after the close here, Tom. Amazon and Apple. So we'll see how they're going to position their companies and their stories and their strategies around this AI play.
I'd like to see more dissent. I'm sure Professor Clarida would disagree with me, but I think the way the Bank of England does it is great. I just think it's a better way. The 10-year yield, 4.03%. Wow. We have economic data. Please stay with us. Thank you, Commonwealth, for your support there. Worldwide, this is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Futures indicate a higher cash open on Wall Street. What's the Fed going to do next? They're going to cut, according to former Fed Vice Chair Richard Clarida. You heard him say that right here on Bloomberg Surveillance. After yesterday's Fed-fueled stock and bond rally, futures again pointing to a higher cash open. Dow futures up 70. S&P mini futures are 32 points higher. And the NASDAQ futures up 118 points. And the number of Americans filing first-time claims for unemployment, 249,000 for the week ended July 27th. That is higher than the previous reading, also higher than estimated, economists surveyed by Bloomberg. So some signs of a weaker labor market moving forward. Meta reporting better than expected sales for the second quarter, among the most actively traded in the pre-market. On the call, Mark Zuckerberg talking about Meta's push into large language models that will power AI chatbots. The 2-year yield right now, 1 basis point lower now, 4.24, and the 10-year is at 4.02%. We check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Tom.
Thanks so much. And markets moved this morning. Our economic indicators in a moving market, brought to you by Commonwealth, supporting more than 2,000 independent financial advisors with a 2-to-1 advisor-to-staff ratio, small firm attentiveness, big advisor impact. Go to commonwealth.com to learn about our consultative support in technology. In 14 minutes, we will do more on a multi-nation prisoner swap with Russia. The news flow on that has been very grudging, a statement from, I believe, the State Department, and that's about it. And we will have that for you. We're working on that right now. Professor Schiller may come back, and we're efforting David Gura as we can. The economic data moves the market. There's no other way to put it. Paul, I'm sorry, 249 is awful close to 250. Claims increase, and unit labor costs decrease. Also the revision, which leads you to that dampening feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just on the initial jobless claims, 249,000. Consensus was 236,000. Remember, last period was 235,000, so a little bit of a tick up there. So we're keeping an eye on that. But let's go right to our next guest, Rob Socken, global economist with Citi. I know those people. 388 Greenwich Street, home of the worst elevators on Wall Street. Talk to us about what you heard from your Federal Reserve yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with the Fed, the statement didn't have as much changes as we were expecting, or I think many were expecting. But then Chair Powell came out and I think was pretty clear that the Fed's getting ready to ease rates in September. And that was the clear message. The second message, though, I think is they are getting a little bit more concerned about that second leg of the mandate. They see the upside risks of inflation have diminished, but some of the downside risks on the activity side have increased. And so I think that's going to be important for guiding policy going forward. It's not just about inflation anymore. It's about both sides of the mandate.
Are you concerned that the Fed is maybe too late in kind of cutting rates?
I don't think so. I think it's interesting. They have been cautious in their holding pattern, maybe even more so than some of these other central banks where you've seen cuts already. But at the same time, the U.S. economy has been very resilient, so they've had less need to cut. I do think you're getting to that point where both sides of the mandate do argue they should cut rates, given the improvement on inflation and the downside risks in the labor market. Right. So I'd be very surprised if they didn't cut in September.
Rob Sokin, we made an upgrade here. We had Clarida in the chair you were in here moments ago, and we went to Citigroup. And of course, what Willem Bouter built with Catherine Mann in the omnibus, the holistic sense of Citigroup economics, goes to a question I asked the vice chairman moments ago, and it's on the Bloomberg screen right now. I got a productivity lift. I got unit labor costs revised in new number in, and there's this overlay of productivity in America. How does Citigroup treat that when you try to interpret our future?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the big debate right now. The productivity numbers have been a lot better over the last year, but it's coming off a period of much weaker productivity. And so the question is, are we moving just back to that pre-pandemic trend, or are we moving to a higher stage of productivity growth? If it's the latter, that's a good argument for how you get a soft landing, and that might be what we're seeing in the labor market. You're seeing wage growth come down as productivity has been higher, but it's a huge debate, and it's very hard to judge these things in real time. Right now, we're skeptical that productivity is durably higher going forward, but that is a real debate, and that could be what's happening and what's driving some of these soft landing narratives.
Where's Hollenhorst after the meeting yesterday? Did you guys make a momentous change? You want to break some news here?
Nope, it's the same spot.
Every meeting, rate up.
Every meeting, and that's really based on that sharp slowdown in the economy that they have. And if you don't get that, I still think you get a few cuts from the Fed this year, but then next year comes to be a bigger question. They'll probably move much slower and more cautiously if you don't get that big slowdown. But right now, same call, cutting at every meeting based on that slowdown in the economy.
I don't know. It feels like a soft landing to me and the John Tuckers of the world. I mean, is that in fact what the Fed has achieved here, do you think?
Right now, that's the way the data are feeling. And I think you heard that from the Fed. I think they feel, too, that they've gotten that soft landing, even though, as I mentioned, they're more concerned about the downside risks. And right now, there's a lot of noise in the data. We're seeing that with jobless claims. Maybe that's a sign things are worsening. But, Q2 GDP came in well above expectations, saw some pickup in some of the PMIs. So far, it's still feeling pretty good. Right. But things can turn quickly, is what our U.S. team would argue.
Link it with the Citigroup platform. Paul and I are standing here. I'm looking, Paul, off that economic data. I wanted to see a 3.99 print on the 10-year. I don't have that. 4.02, which is still, oh, wow.
Yep.
I got a real yield of 1.79%, out of range finally. Oh, wow. And I got equities. Scott Cronitz going, I can retire. Exactly. Oh, wow. What is our audience is saying, okay, wait a minute. America's flat on its back. There's all these anecdotes out on Twitter of half the country's unemployed. And yet I got, oh, wow, statistics. Why?
Yeah, as you said, there's all these anecdote stories about things slowing down. And there's some, if you look at some of the data, you could argue that that's where things are heading. But for the most part, the economy's been enormously resilient, and inflation has continued to improve. And I think that's what you're seeing reflected in the data. 2.8% on GDP in Q2, a consumer that keeps spending. confidence is very low if you look at consumer confidence surveys, but you don't see that reflected in the hard data. And as I said, we're seeing improvements in inflation. The last few months of inflation have been very good, and wage growth is falling. So I think that's what you're seeing reflected. The data are looking a lot better than the anecdotes.
Neil Dutta publishing moments ago, he's so snarky. I mean, Dutta's nailed it so well, and the optimism coming out of the pandemic. Paul Sweeney, he goes, oops. Yep. And basically within a longer paragraph, thank you, Neil Dutta, for sending this in. In my view, the upshot is this is a small policy mistake that can be undone very quickly. So I guess I got to actually pay attention to the Fed minutes and the Fed speeches. I never do.
No, I let Mike McKee do
But there it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
All right, so what do you make? We were just talking to Richard Clarida about the global debt, the U.S. debt deficits. How do you guys think about that stuff? I mean, at some point it's going to matter, but again, I'm of an age when I say I've heard this my whole life. That means something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's a real challenge. I mean, if you look, we have a nice table, kind of a heat map that looks at vulnerability across major governments in terms of things like debt servicing, debt levels, and the U.S. ranks as the most worrying across all of those metrics on average. But you're not really seeing that reflected in markets. You saw a little bit of that last year. People were really getting concerned. You've seen blips of it this year. But so far, markets have been willing to absorb that debt. And so until that stops, I think you're going to see bigger deficits and bigger debt going forward.
Rob Sockin, thank you for the brief. We had a huge economics morning. It's wonderful to have you finish it out for us. Mr. Sockin is with Citigroup as well. Futures up 31, yields move off the economic data, claims elevated. With our news in New York City, John Tucker.
All right, Paul and Tom. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich has been released by Russia in a multi-country prisoner swap. Swap also includes Marine veteran Paul Whelan. The man jailed in Russia on espionage charges, and the U.S. Denies that. They're en route to destinations outside of Russia. According to people familiar with the situation, the U.S. and its allies will return prisoners to Russia that they hold under the deal. Professor Wendy Schiller, director of the Alfred Talbin Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University, spoke to Bloomberg about it.
I think that, if Biden were still running, he would make an argument that engagement and diplomacy and conversation, even with people who are perceived to be our enemies, is always important in the world order. That's an argument he would have made, and he would have had, 50 years to back that up. Does Kamala Harris take that on? Probably not right now. It's not been her theme, but certainly credits the idea of engagement when Donald Trump's position and his party's position veers towards isolationism.
That's Wendy Schiller with Brown University. The Israeli military saying today it's confirmed that the head of Hamas's military wing, Mohammed Dif, was killed in an airstrike in Gaza back in July. The announcement coming a day after an apparent Israeli strike in the Iranian capital killed Hamas's top political leader. And there's backlash over Donald Trump's comments about his potential opponent in the presidential race at the NABJ, the former president, saying Vice President Kamala Harris did not identify as black until recently. It got contentious when Trump said Harris would address the convention by teleconference while he claimed he was not given that option.
I was told my opponent was going to be here. It turned out my opponent isn't here. You invited me under false pretense. And then you said you can't do it with Zoom. Well, where's Zoom? She's going to do it with Zoom, and she's not coming.
Meanwhile, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro met with Harris's representatives as the Democratic candidate has to pick a running mate soon. The Paris Games, overall medal count, the U.S. 31, France 26, China has 21 medals. Global news 24 hours a day. And whatever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Tom.
It has been extraordinary news flow. My husband's spending, I've had almost no sleep off of the Fed show yesterday. Thank you to our team for putting it together. Best show ever we've done. And Paul, can we just digress to something not about economics, finance, investment, or jazz Chisholm? Can we just do something? Here's the fact. John, help me out here. I'm spending $79 a month on YouTube TV. Oh, I got an $8 overlay of Peacock so that, Vet Bill can watch the Olympics. Now, Hannah Miller's reporting that the Disney Fox Warner Brothers Sports Combine, they're going to take $42.99 a month.
Yep.
Your reaction to this is 1985.
This is another step in the way to just streaming everything effectively, and particularly sports. So it's going to have, as you mentioned, Tom, Disney, which gets you some ESPN stuff, Fox, Warner Brothers Discovery. So you get some NFL stuff, some NBA stuff. What's notable is what's not there. CBS is not there. Oh, they have NFL as well. Whole NBC Universal, the whole NBC, which gets you, all the Universal stuff. That's not part of it. So again, it's up to you and all consumers to figure out what they want to pay for and how they want to pay for it. Man, it was so much easier back in the day with a cable package.
The streaming, what's it called? Venue.
Venue.
Well, that really works. VENU.
Yep.
Will Venue Sports allow me, like MLB, to watch 3 National Football League games at the same time?
I don't know.
We don't know.
I don't know. But it's going to... This is just one step into where we're going to get to, where everything is effectively streamed and nothing of value will be on broadcasting cable.
But it's getting us out to $300 a month. Tucker, are you spending $300 a month at home?
The rabbit ears, free.
The rabbit ears are working just
Reruns
fine.
of the Andy Griffith Show, free. It depends what you want.
Exactly, but if
you're not selective,
sports, Tom. I mean, this got your attention because it's sports, and what's the price? $42.99? I have no idea. Because there are prices out there.
That's $43 a month for those.
Exactly,
keeping
from
score
$10 to $100 a month. There's all.
There
kinds
we
of
go.
packages.
That's the first pricing of this new sports thing, and
yeah, there you go.
We will see. We'll continue to.
It'll
monitor.
pop up in your credit card statement.
Oh yes, it will. Also, my 3 Netflix subscriptions. Right. I don't know where that came up. Markets lift. Futures up 25. Nasdaq up 0.4%. Across the nation, Bloomberg surveillance.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's start with the data. Yields, they fell. They were higher earlier after the continuing claims, jobless claims hitting the highest since November of 2021. This speaks to more evidence of a weakening labor market. Also strengthens the case for easier Fed policy. After that Fed-fueled rally in stocks and bonds yesterday, futures right now, they are pointing to a higher cash open on Wall Street. And this morning, shares of NVIDIA most active, up over 2%. Meta Platforms in the pre-market up close to 9% after the upbeat earnings forecast for Meta Platforms. S&P futures right now 27 points higher. That's up 0.5%. The Dow futures up 52 points. That's a rise of 0.1%. The Nasdaq E-mini futures 97 points higher. That is up 0.5%. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and it's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Tom.
John Tucker, thanks so much. I want to give you a vignette, folks, into how we operate at Bloomberg Surveillance. With the heritage of Matt Winkler and John Micklethwaite, we are fact-based. Jennifer Jacobs is leading our coverage here on this prisoner swap. The initial 2 or 3 paragraphs of Ms. Jacobs was very curt, very straightforward, almost like a State Department release. And Paul, that's the way it stayed. You go to the Wall Street Journal website, which I went to 2 minutes ago, and the story's really not out there yet.
No, it's not.
And I think this is important across the nation to understand this is breaking. To give you one vignette, and this is the Telegraph in London, and they've got key moments, they call it. And beginning at 3 a.m. this morning, Russian jail moves, mystery prompts hopes. Then 20 to 30 prisoners is the idea. That was a surprise, according to our Roz Matheson. And then there's further dripping of news out. But I don't have a major story on this yet. It is very, may I state, Paul, and editorialize, it reads like a movie?
It does, and I think we've seen that movie before. For what it's worth, again, the cable networks are starting to carry this story at the moment. So, but you're right, Tom. It is absolutely breaking.
Joining us now, Wendy Schiller, with a history of this, of course, at Brown University in the Tubman Center. Wendy, I think I said to you an hour or two ago, I can't remember, a Tom Hanks movie and a prisoner swap. But as I see the names leaking out speculation of who these names are. What is the difference between the prisoners America and the allies are getting versus the prisoners that Russia's getting?
Well, the only thing we can interpret right now with the knowledge we have is that Putin values the release of these prisoners, either for domestic reasons, it could be internal politics within his own government. He wants to show, that he can still be a partner with other nations in reasonable negotiations in his mind. And you can say that people were unduly detained in Russia, the American hostages in particular, but nonetheless, he is portraying the image of somebody that people can work with. And I don't think the timing is accidental. I think it's an adjustment to what's going on in the American political scene right now at the presidential level. It's also, I think it reflects a little bit of the stalemate in Ukraine.
Okay, I'm going to go there because you went there, Professor Schiller. Are you suggesting that this was sped up because of the advent of Vice President Harris into our presidential race?
I think that Putin recognizes he wants to be in the mix with whoever wins this election. And he doesn't really gain from being demonized by the Democrats. Biden certainly being what we call old school in terms of sort of a Cold War and a product of the Cold War, was doing quite a bit of that. I don't think Harris will focus as much on that. And certainly Trump doesn't do it at all. So Putin wants to end up somewhere in the middle of that intellectual framing on what kind of partner he can be and what role he plays in the world.
Tom, we have a red headline across the Bloomberg terminal. Correct. Wall Street Journal reporter to be released by Russia in prisoner swap. So again, as you highlighted, Tom, this is a fluid situation.
It's a fluid situation. I really want to emphasize this. We believe at Bloomberg, we don't do rumor, we don't do speculation, but we're going to aggregate in legitimate news sources, and we're doing that right now with the leadership of our Jennifer Jacobs at Bloomberg News. Incredibly fluid situation.
All right, let's move on. Wendy, we're right smack in the middle of this very contentious presidential election race. The next issue, I guess, for VP Harris is to pick a vice presidential candidate. What's the latest on that?
Well, we've heard that the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, I believe, is meeting or talking, you reported that, to her team. If I had to guess, I'd say it's down to Mark Kelly and Josh Shapiro. It's easier to take a senator out of a state. Arizona has a law that says the governor has to replace a senator with the same party person, so the Democrats don't lose a seat. And a special election or general election won't be held for 2 more years for that seat. So the Democrats actually are okay if Kelly leaves Arizona. But Pennsylvania is, I think, a little trickier to estimate. Is Josh Shapiro stronger for Kamala Harris in Pennsylvania as governor with the machine that he's built to win the governorship 2 years ago? Or is he better on the ticket to bring Pennsylvania, but also other states like Pennsylvania? And I think he's also an observant Jewish person. He has made that part of his persona. It has resonated not only with Jewish community, but also with religious people of different religious backgrounds. He talks about his faith a lot. So whether that's good for Harris or not, we're not sure.
I have never written a song about this, but I'm going to go there, Professor Schiller. 1960, my mother took me out to see Richard Nixon with a 3-day beard, wool, Republicans, cigars. And there were a beautiful spring morning with JFK in a lovely blue silk suit and Mrs. Kennedy next to him. And guess what? The entire uproar where I lived was, OMG, he's Catholic. And to speak to you in Providence and Brown University folks, I hate to say that was a huge deal then. With great respect, Wendy Schiller, are we going to have a huge deal if it's a Harris-Shapiro ticket?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a factor. I mean, nobody should put their head in the sand and say, someone who's a woman of color and a Jewish candidate. Now, Lieberman was Jewish, ran with Gore
Good point.
2000.
Thank you.
Right. So we've had that before. And you are, not only, Tom, are you right about 1960, but certainly the primaries, the very few primaries that they had, the Democrats, before that, Hubert Humphrey made an issue of JFK's Catholicism. So, it wasn't just an issue in America, it was an issue in the Democratic Party at that time. So yes, I think, and also let's not forget Israel Gaza and the disaffected younger voters and also people in Michigan of Palestinian Arab descent. How will that play? Josh Shapiro is a strong avowed supporter of Israel. You know, you have to weigh who's going to bring you votes, who's going to lose you votes. You know, if you have to think about neutrality, I think Mark Kelly is a more neutral choice than Josh Shapiro. And Josh Shapiro himself may be thinking of running in 28 if he wins re-election in 26. So very complicated calculation.
Yeah, okay, I got to be quick here. Paul Sweeney, how many times have you seen Top Gun?
Oh, too many to count.
Come on, how many? A dozen?
40, 50
Professor
times.
Schiller, how many times have you seen Top Gun?
I've seen Top Gun a lot, and also Top Gun Maverick, I think actually might be better than Top Gun.
Okay,
so I recommend
you're
if you haven't
telling
seen it, you
me
should see it.
the vice president's going to turn down Top Gun from Arizona?
I'm saying that I think it's the same as, you know, it's a more neutral and I think a slightly safer choice for lots of different reasons to pick Mark Kelly over Josh Shapiro.
This has been wonderful. Professor Schiller, you're such a trooper. We're hugely valued. Her civics textbook is definitive, and we're thrilled to have her on to give you a historical perspective of these moments as well. Should we quote the market now?
Let's quote
Would that
the
be
market
good
here.
to do?
We can do that.
We can do that. We're
do that in
30 minutes away from a market opening as we do international relations and economics. That's all we're doing. Futures up 29. Paul Sweeney, the NASDAQ. I mean, you know, Tucker, do you understand Sweeney's rocking a 601K after what NVIDIA's doing?
Why is he still here?
we just love people here.
Please don't leave.
NASDAQ up 0.4%. That's kind of a strong suit here today. On the yields, Tom, we've got the 10-year Treasury. We're 4.02%, pretty much unchanged on the day. But we've got to call out gold again, another high, just under $2,500 per ounce on gold. And we're talking to Wei Li from BlackRock. That's been the best performing asset.
Well, we'll have to see. We're going to come back with more from Bloomberg News on a prisoner swap. It's August 1st. Taylor Swift told me.
Never have I ever before, but I can see it's lost in the memory. August slipped away into a moment in time, 'cause it was never mine. And I can see it's twisted in bed sheets. August slipped away like a bottle of wine.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene and Paul Sweeney.
We're addicted to the parlor game, the Fed, the monetary ballet.
Where do you see opportunities in a fixed income space here in 24?
With Lisa Mateo on markets.
AI affecting demand for cloud computing.
And Michael Barr with news.
Another legal setback for Donald Trump, this time across the pond.
The best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. This is Bloomberg Surveillance on Bloomberg Radio.
Good morning, everyone. Tom Keene and Paul Sweeney on an extraordinary Thursday, I should say, across this nation when the Fed decides. I'm mixing up my days here. Exceptional news flow this morning with futures up 29. And of course, the lead story across America is some form of complexity of a, quote, major prisoner swap between the United States and its allies and Russia. Our Jennifer Jacobs and Keene reporting that it is underway, but I really want to be delicate here, folks. There is not a news blackout, but there is a quiet within the multiple players. And Paul Sweeney, the Moscow Times last night, headlining 20 to 30 involved.
Okay. So this is, again, seems to be an ongoing developing situation, and we'll have full reporting on that.
From Dubai, we're getting him in this, the mystery and the quiet of this news flow. Greg Sullivan joins us, expert on Russia, and of course, leading our Russia economic coverage from Dubai. Greg, we need to be delicate here about the two major American prisoners, Gershkovich and Whelan, as well. But is it normal from where you sit and Roz Matheson sits that there is a mystery at this moment in the morning?
Well, and certainly this is a developing situation, and there's a lot that we still don't know and a lot of details that we still expect to come. What we do know is that there is an exchange underway that does appear to be rather complex, involves several countries, and we have learned that Russia is set to or expected to release Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, as well as former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan, both of which the U.S. administration has sought for some time.
A completely unfair question. I assume the answers you don't know, but I must ask. Do we have any reporting that Mr. Gershkovich and Whelan are together?
It's unclear how this is going down. Like I said, there are a lot of details that are still forthcoming, a lot of things that we don't know, including how or when or where they're being transported. So at this point, we don't know if they're being transported together or with whom. We also don't know who else is being exchanged.
Greg, this has obviously been in the works for a long time. We know that. Is there anything unique about the timing of why now?
That's certainly a question that we're looking to try to answer. It seemed to happen rather quickly. There were, of course, the trial of Evan Gershkovich was moved up. The hearing was supposed to be in August, and it was moved up by nearly a month so that they could sentence him. That was an early indication that something might be afoot. There have been several other cases where sentences have happened abruptly, plea deals have been made, so certainly things did seem to be rushed. There's obvious things that we could speculate about, whether it's the U.S. election or other things, but at this point it's unclear why now and why things have been sped up.
I must bring up a name, the Telegraph reporting this, and Greg, if you're not briefed on this, I fully understand. As well, another American, a Russian-American journalist with Radio Free Europe, released over a year, and that is Alsu Kermasheva. Can you tell us a bit about her, if you may?
That's certainly been a name that has come up. She was also sentenced on the same day as Evan Gershkovich. She was detained in Russia when she was back visiting. She's a dual U.S. Russian citizen. It's unclear whether she's part of this exchange or not, but certainly her name has come up in discussions about who could possibly be involved among the detained Americans in Russia.
Greg Sullivan, thank you so much. Exceptionally busy day with futures up 30. Let's get a briefing now, Bloomberg Business Brief with John Tucker.
All right, Paul and Tom, hello. Soft landing, more evidence. Labor markets slowing. Initial applications for unemployment benefits jumping to the highest level almost a year. Worker productivity increased in the second quarter by more than forecast. That's helping temper growth in labor costs, adding evidence of diminishing inflationary pressures. Treasury yields racing an earlier climb. Stocks pointing to further gains after the market scored its best Fed day in 2 years yesterday. Leading the tech charge this morning, shares of Meta Platforms up over 9% after their earnings report. Dow futures up 86. The S&P futures 29 points higher. The Nasdaq E-mini futures right now up 91 points. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Tom.
Exceptionally busy day here with some economic data coming out, but there's the bigger picture as we talked to Richard Clarida about. Down at Duke, other than figuring out the new framework for the football season, the basketball season, getting, through it all, the heat of the summer, there are people thinking about the bigger American picture.
And one of those, Tom. Cam Harvey, professor of finance at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. Professor Harvey, thanks so much for joining us here. What did you hear from your Federal Reserve Chairman yesterday afternoon?
Well, obviously the message has changed. They're signaling that there will be a cut likely in September. I've talked to you before about this. I believe it's very disappointing that they should have acted with the cut like yesterday, and that's just not the case. The language did change in the statement in certain key ways. So now they're not as much concerned about inflation, and they're talking about the dual mandate, but inflation still is an issue, and it shouldn't be. And the reason is that if you look at the actual year-over-year inflation that's reported, it's 2.97%. And that seems elevated because the Fed's target is 2%. However, that is driven almost entirely by a shelter inflation that's running year over year at 5.2%. And shelter is 36% of the CPI. And that 5.2% is disconnected from reality. That represents what happened last year. And if you look at current prices, like year-over-year rents or things like that, the inflation that should be reported in real time is 1.5%, well below the Fed's target. And it's been below the target for almost a year. So the Fed is very late again. So they were late to raise interest rates when they were kind of brushing off the inflation surge, and they're late to reduce the rates. And the cost could be very substantial. The cost is that the Fed, by its actions, basing policy on past data rather than future, could push us into an economic slowdown. I certainly hope it's only like a soft landing.
Right. Professor, you got to help me here. I mean, I remember when Paul Sweeney wandered through Econ 462 at Duke Economics, behavioral economics. I brought this up with Rich Clarida yesterday. All I'm seeing here, Professor, is massive Kahneman and Tversky, massive regret aversion. Discuss that they're scared stiff of the recent errors over the last 20 years in monetary policy.
Yeah, to me, like two negatives don't make a positive. So making a mistake early on by being late and letting inflation surge, that was a clear mistake. And I believe they're in the midst of making another mistake. Yes, they want to be very risk averse. They are data driven. They say this so many times. Well, look at the data. But you need to be careful at the data that you're actually looking at. You need to understand that the only reason that inflation has remained above 3% over the last year is because of a distorted shelter inflation that represents what happened last year. And policy cannot be formed based upon last year's data. It needs to be formed based upon real-time data. So you're right. There's a lot of behavioral stuff going on, but there's also just a fundamental misread of the data.
All right. So, Cam, is the data telling you, just broad economic data today, that we are in fact not in for a soft landing, that in fact we really run the risk of, something much different, maybe even a recession, as Danielle DiMartino Booth from QI said yesterday on our air?
Again, it depends upon your definition of soft landing. So there have been a number of recessions that have been soft. So, for example, having a recession where year over year growth in GDP never turns negative. So we've had those types of recessions. So I include kind of a mild recession in the soft landing category. So given the economic fundamentals, we're more oriented towards the soft landing. And I look at a number of indicators. So number one is kind of a coincident indicator, but sometimes it lags a little bit, and that's retail sales. So retail sales are highly correlated with personal consumption expenditures, and personal consumption expenditures, 2/3 of GDP, closer to 70%.
Can you see
those retail sales have been flat.
Can you see
and those retail sales are reported in nominal terms, not even real terms. That will spill into consumption.
We got to go, Professor Harvey. But Paul, can you see President Harvey at the Atlanta Fed?
Oh yeah.
I mean, can you see that tone? What would you do with the Atlanta Fed now, President Harvey? How would you change the discussion given your stridency?
Well, I guess I'm disqualified being Canadian. But again, the key is to look at the data carefully, to brush off the behavioral bias, and to focus on data that are forward-looking, like expectations and things that don't necessarily have an anchor in the past, like the housing, inflation. Right. So you need to look forward And I don't believe the Fed has done that. The same problem at looking at the past data and getting hung up on it caused the mistake leading to the inflation surge.
This has been superb. Professor Harvey, thank you so much. At Paul Sweeney's at Duke. Paul, I looked up North Carolina unemployment.
Yep.
And it's like, I think 3.6%. I don't have it in front of me because we're worried about the prisoner exchange story. But Paul, the unemployment rate in North Carolina is below where it was in 2019.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, it's a better number than what we had. And that's, again, that fully employed.
And a lot of people
It's not
moving.
gonna
It's one of
change.
those places, Tom, during the pandemic, a lot of people moving in to North Carolina. You know, big surge there. And so they've got the technology as well supporting that economy.
I really want to, I've never seen this. I've been doing this for what, 5-6 years?
Yeah, a couple.
Something like that. I've never seen this, folks, and I want to be very careful. And we at Bloomberg, with the leadership of Jennifer Jacobs, are being very careful on the news. Let me get it up here right now off of the Bloomberg surveillance top page. And this is Jennifer Jacobs and Keene reporting that Evan Gershkovich to be freed by Russia in major prisoner swap. For those of you driving on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, cable TV is lit up with this story, and there is a thundering silence from print journalism. I can't emphasize, I've never seen this before. We at Bloomberg will be continuing to report facts as we see it on a multi-ally major prisoner swap.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. The stock futures right now indicate a higher open on Wall Street. U.S. yields fell after continuing claims hit the highest since November of 2021. The initial jobless claims number, the highest almost a year. This speaks to continued weakening of the labor market, strengthens the case for easier Fed policy. And after the Fed-fueled rally in stocks and bonds, futures again pointing to a higher cash open on Wall Street. And this morning, shares of NVIDIA most active. They were up over 2%. And Meta Platforms in the pre-market close to 9% higher after their upbeat earnings forecast. S&P futures 19 points higher. That's up 0.4%. And the Dow futures 62 points higher. Nasdaq E-mini futures up 34 points. That's a rise of 0.2%. And we check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Tom.
John Tucker, thanks so much. The summer games and all going on there. It gets better and better every day. Summer Games updates here on Bloomberg, brought to you by State Street Global Advisors. We have any number of stories right now. We're thrilled to tell you that Elliot Ackerman will join us here in about 15 minutes with perspective. And from where I sit with all the aggregated news sources and the great work of Jennifer Jacobs at Bloomberg News, a major prisoner swap is going on, and it is extremely fluid at this hour. And we'll just simply have to see. Our headline, U.S. reporter to be freed by Russia in major prisoner swap involving 20, even 30 people as well. We hope to have much more on that off of our government desk with Rosalind Matheson. We'll do that through the day here at Bloomberg. We've done so much today on international relations. We had some economic data, boosted productivity. I thought for a second I get a 10-year yield of 3.99%. Good morning, Ian Lingen. Good morning, Bob Michael. 4.02. That's pretty close,
Yep,
Paul.
that's good enough for me.
There, Blake Gwynn is aged at RBC. Just in the last 12 hours, he's aged. Why don't you bring in Blake Gwynn here, who's just aged off of the Fed meeting?
Absolutely. Blake Gwynn. He is head of U.S. rate strategy at RBC Capital Markets. Blake, it seems like you and the folks in the rates markets, you've been pricing this in over the last several weeks here that the Fed is likely to cut in September. Is that your takeaway from yesterday?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, September's basically on unless something goes horribly wrong. I mean, I think if we get a 0.4 month over month type of print on core CPI, maybe it could be derailed. But it looks like September's on. It kind of strikes me too. It's you mentioned the bond markets having already priced it in. A lot of this talk about, the Fed's got to hike, things are bad. I mean, very few people are actually exposed to the Fed funds rate. I mean, people care about the 5-year rate, the 10-year rate. Do you think a mortgage borrower really cares where the actual Fed funds rate is? Because, that mortgage is already pricing in 7 cuts by the end of 2025. So, to some respect, a lot of people, or if you think about financial conditions, they already have 7 cuts priced in over the next year and a half. So, yeah, we've been pricing that in, and I think that's already apparent in financial conditions. And the Fed just, we just have to see how they're going to move along that path.
Well, we started 2023 with thinking in maybe 6 rate cuts, and then we didn't really get any here. I'm sorry, in 24. So the market's been wrong in the past here. What gives you confidence that maybe this Fed will be a consistent cutter of rates?
I think the case is better here. I mean, I think, what we heard from Powell yesterday was really about the risk coming back into balance. And I think what we see, and I think what the Fed is probably looking at now is more kind of a gradual adjustment process. We're much more positive on the economic outlook. We're not really as worried about some of these downside, hard landing type of risks. I think Powell mirrored that view yesterday. I think he took a very balanced approach. I think where markets are starting to push is that the risks aren't balanced, that there's actually more risk to the downside on the labor growth side than there is upside risk to inflation. But, for ourselves and for Powell, I think we see those things as balanced. And that argues for getting rates back to something that's closer to short run neutral. Powell clearly believes we're a restrictive territory. If you really believe the risks are balanced on both sides, you should probably be closer to neutral. So a very gradual kind of adjustment back down.
Blake, I saw log convexity yesterday with yields curving lower with a certain acceleration. Was that an overlay of the political moment of Israel and all that on top of the Fed, or was that discrete to a Fed discussion?
I think the reaction to the Fed itself was actually very minimal. We had those headlines on Israel, Iran hit a few minutes after the press conference was over. Keep in mind that was 30 minutes ahead of the month end, when we're always going to see, when we typically see some buying flows. So I think there were a lot of things in the mix. Also, we had been rallying throughout the morning. We had the Treasury refunding announcement in the morning that, gave a little bit of a bid to yields. And we also had some data that also probably furthered that. So I think it's tough to disentangle, but my view is that, the Fed was pretty in line with expectations. So only a small portion of that, 10-ish basis point rally we saw across the curve yesterday was really related specifically to the Fed.
Blake, what are folks in the rates market, in the Treasury market, thinking about the rate or the velocity at which the Fed will cut in 2025? Is this something that happens, I don't know, every meeting, every other meeting, 25 bips, 50 basis points? What's the market thinking?
I would say the consensus is probably in every other meeting pace, but where you see pricing starting to push, I think where markets want to push that narrative is really to the more kind of panicked type of scenario. So you see people trying to price in that 50 basis point cut, in September. You see people pricing in every meeting path. So I think we were fully priced for kind of an every other meeting gradual path. And now the margins are trying to push more towards that kind of hard landing, the place where the Fed has more urgency and really is moving more quickly to get those rates down. But I think in general, consensus is still for every other meeting. I will just say our call, again, we are more positive on the economic outlook, and we actually have a very abbreviated cycle that looks like 95, 98, 2019, where we have 4 cuts and then basically a long pause.
All right, so we still have, I'm just looking at the yield curve, it's still inverted 2s, 10s. It's less inverted than it used to be, granted, but do we care about that stuff anymore?
Not as a signal of recession, I don't think.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think when we're thinking about the curve, I do think, in general, there's still this kind of idea that, the election probably represents some steepening risk, particularly on a Trump win. So we have curves kind of hitting a local steep right around the time of the election. But again, with that call that I just mentioned, the Fed call, where we do not see the Fed cutting as much as markets currently do, we have more that kind of flattening picking back up again in 2025. So we have 2s, 10s. Unfortunately for a lot of investors who like that positive sloped yield curve, we have that staying inverted for quite a while.
Blake, thank you so much. Very valuable, particularly with the set of fixed income movements we see. Let's start with the Sweeney yield. I'm not going to go to the T-bill. You're triple leveraged all cash. You don't look at the T-bill. It's inconsequential. 4.25% in the 2-year. That's a movement.
That is.
Of the last number. I mean, when do you go, all the people that are saying get out long. I'm not sure about that. The 10-year yield is exactly 4.02%. That's a wow statistic.
Yep, we're in the 399 watch.
Major shout out. Ian Lincoln and others calling for lower rates. David Rosenberg, among others there. The 10-year real yield, 1.80%. It was a bit lower earlier, but that inflation-adjusted yield is coming down. And I'm sorry, your professor from Duke University, is it Mr. Harvey?
Yes, it is.
Professor Harvey was fired up.
He's on fire. He's had this argument for a while. He's been on that call. Even when they were raising rates, he was kind of talking about that in terms of what data you should look at.
I regret a version I mentioned, which is Daniel Kahneman, and that's sort of like when Jack Flaherty is traded from the Detroit Tigers. There's a lot of regret. There's just a lot of regret out there.
Exactly.
After trade, Michael Barr just walked in, folks,
I know.
so I had to,
his voice is coming back slowly.
The Detroit Tigers. He's making Tucker look good. You okay over there? What a news day!
Oh, what a news day!
Just truly amazing. The VIX hasn't really come in. For those of you in the equity market, 16.24. And it's got like a 15 feel, but we're not there yet, which is maybe the political feeling. Which earnings are you going to look at this afternoon?
Oh, boy, I'm going to look at Apple. Well, you get Apple and Amazon. So those are the two big ones. And you're going to get from Amazon an AI call. And from Apple, you're going to get, is this iPhone 16 that I am going to acquire in September?
There we go.
Am I part of the super cycle, Tom?
They'll probably mention you on the conference call today. Stay with us. Carol and Tim with the coverage of earnings this afternoon. From New York City, Bloomberg's surveillance.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. As we await the opening bell, the latest economic figures signal further cooling, adding to the case for a Fed rate cut in September. This morning, we saw unemployment claims hitting the highest level in about a year, and worker productivity also beating forecasts. Right out of the gate, the S&P 500 17 points higher, a rise of 0.3%, 55.39 of the index. Dow Jones Industrial Average up 124 points. That's up 0.3%. And the Nasdaq 100, the first trade's opening, right now up 14 points. That is up a tenth of a percent right now. We check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Tom.
John Tucker, thank you so much. We welcome all of you across this nation. Jennifer Jacobs reporting for Bloomberg that there is a prisoner swap of some form underway by Russia, and very importantly, not just the United States, but the United States and allies. It is extremely fluid at this point. We will continue to bring you news. I will say to all of you, particularly on Apple CarPlay and on Android Auto, that there is a silence among the American news organizations, the print organizations, where a lot of cable TV is covering this. But I want to be clear, it is underway. The prisoner swap is not completed. Megan Horniman will join us here in a moment on the markets, but first, we're honored to have with us Elliot Ackerman. His book of the summer a few years ago with James Stavridis, was 2034. They do it again this summer. One of my two books of the summer, 2054, where Elliot Ackerman is thinking into the future of our relationships with China, with India, and of course, always with Russia. Elliot Ackerman, you are the real deal. You have been awarded Purple Hearts and various other awards by the United States Marine Corps. How do you presume that you do a prisoner swap?
Well, I think what we're already seeing into this prisoner swap is pretty multidimensional. I mean, it involves over 24 prisoners across multiple countries, to include Germany, and the details are still pretty close hold. But I think the first thing that needs to be considered is whether or not this swap is ultimately, frankly, just a good deal. And we've seen in the past administrations accepting swaps, frankly, that aren't good deals. I'm thinking in particular, the prisoner swap for Bo Bergdahl during the Afghan war. And, when we accept those types of bad deal prisoner swaps, it only encourages more prisoners being taken for political reasons. devil is in the details, and I think we should all be paying attention to those details as they come out.
From where you sit, who in the United States government and administration negotiates a prisoner swap?
Early reports is obviously that the White House is intimately involved, as is our National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. But this is also something that is going to have heavy involvement by our intelligence agencies and CIA. And the imprisonment of Paul Whelan and Evan Gershkovich has been pretty high profile for quite some time. And the people who've been working on the swap have really frankly been at it for, in the case of Paul Whelan, years. And intimately involved in the details of what sounds like a pretty complex arrangement at this point to get the Russians to move.
Elliot, to what extent are these prisoner swaps kind of a policy or a strategy of Mr. Putin to just grab a high-profile athlete or a reporter off the street and then negotiate for some significant assets on the other side?
Well, that's exactly it. In the case of Putin or other rogue regimes like the Ayatollahs in Iran, this is very much a central point of their foreign policy, frankly, is when they can grab relatively high-profile individuals and use them as collateral in other negotiations. They do. We saw this around the Iran nuclear deal. Part of our negotiations, the Iran nuclear deal, was a swap of 5 political prisoners. And we're seeing this now in Russia as well. And so, again, what becomes a problem is this gets normalized, it becomes a threat to Americans abroad. That, you could, if you're traveling to any of these areas, be very, very careful, because you could quickly find yourself a pawn in a much larger international game that's very high stakes.
Elliot Ackerman, thank you so much for joining us briefly this morning. In the midst of a reported prisoner swap between Russia and U.S. and their allies, our Jennifer Jacobs leading our coverage, and we'll have much more on this. I will state here at 9:34 Wall Street time, it is a fluid story. We will report facts as they come out. Right now, there is a thundering silence, to say the least. So Dow up 186 points.
Yeah, it's on. The market's opening strong here this morning. S&P up 0.5%. The Nasdaq up about 0.4%. Megan Horniman joins us. She's the CIO at Verdant Capital Advisors. So, Megan, just looking at yesterday's price action and this open this morning, it appears like investors are pretty much saying September's a done deal. Was that your takeaway from yesterday's performance by the Federal Reserve?
I think it's definitely on the table, and they made that clear. I think the biggest change in their comments was the fact that they, instead of just focusing on the inflation risks, they brought up their dual mandate. So they're obviously getting a little concerned about what's going on in the labor market. And the data we got this morning definitely didn't paint a good picture for the labor market, but it is one data point. And we do know there's some seasonality around the July numbers. Let's keep in mind, they'll still get 2 employment reports before that September meeting. So I don't want to put too much ahead of what may happen in September. I think it's on the table, and the Fed said if the data continues to go the way they expected, that they will cut in September.
It's also a market, Megan, that I think is really, obviously driven by earnings. We're going to get a couple of big ones here today after the close, Amazon and Apple. How concerned are you about this market in terms of market concentration? We have seen some broadening out over the past couple of weeks, but boy, it kind of makes it feel like Apple and Amazon really got to do a good job this afternoon to keep this market going. How do you think about the tech weighting?
I think it still is. It's a bit concerning to us. I think it still is way too much of a concentrated rally that we've seen. And let's keep in mind that these valuations, even in tech, are very elevated. So if the Fed doesn't come through delivering what's expected in the market, this could uproot what we've seen here in tech. The other thing with tech is they've been very interest rate sensitive. So we're seeing a move down in treasury yields, and that's been benefiting technology as well. But if that reverses course, then tech is in for, I think some more correction.
I think that's been underplayed. I think, Megan, that's a really important theme, that with yield down folks, what are called duration assets do better. I'm too tired to do the math right now, but Megan will give me an audible on that. Megan, what I would say is this. I believe I've identified a bull market, and part of it is there are pauses to refresh our fear. Has that occurred in the last number of days?
Pauses in the technology. I mean, we did see that where we saw some rotation there. But let's just keep in mind this market in general, I think, is priced for perfection, and that's concerning to us. Also, in August and September, that tends to be pretty seasonally weak months. So I don't want to buy into this rally, even though the earnings have been relatively good. I'm not ready to buy into that growth tech rally here.
What parts of the market do screen well for you guys?
Right now, what we're looking to do is we have a heavy amount of cash on the sidelines. We did just recently put some of that cash to work in fixed income. We did both municipals and then taxable bonds as well. We thought the yields had, kind of backed up enough that it made sense to put some of that cash to work with the anticipation of whether the Fed cuts in September or December. We didn't want cash to be that much of a drag here. But what we're doing is we're waiting for some opportunities in things like the small and mid-cap space. They had a pretty big bounce here recently, but I think there'll be better opportunity as the economy slows. Well, then we'll also look at some of the large cap, but right now, from a valuation perspective, that's really the only thing that looks appealing right now.
Fascinating. So you go into the earnings this afternoon ready to get out the buy ticket on Apple if they deliver the goods?
No, I still think right now that the valuations are just too stretched right there in that entire sector. So we're not really looking to jump into that right now.
I love busting her chops. It's just great. Megan Horniman, thank you so much for that buy order on Apple Computer. I'm kidding. Megan Horniman with us here, and just a terrific news flash, Chief Investment Officer, Verdant's Capital as well. Markets are open, and again, they're green. And the VIX is in, but it's not in like you'd expect. We have a print of Dow 41,000, not futures. The market open 41,031. I guess rounded up 5,600 on SPX. We're not there yet. I'm making that up. But there we are in the 10-year yield, Paul. Look at that. I missed this, folks. To 4 digits, the 10-year yield 4.006. Which is, I got to get this out. I mean, John Tucker wants his fair and equal time here. John's been here since 2 a.m.
I know, he's not going there.
But no, I do not have a 3.99 on the 10-year yield. So we can go to our news in New York City, John Tucker.
All right, Paul and Tom, as we've been reporting, Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and Marine veteran Paul Whelan being released as part of a major prisoner swap with Russia. Both Americans had been convicted of espionage charges they long denied. Bloomberg's Greg Sullivan covers Russia from Dubai. Says it seems to fit a pattern for Vladimir Putin using captured Americans as leverage.
It's very clear that that there have been an uptick in arrests of Americans, and we've seen over the past couple of years some high-profile swaps. So that accusation has been leveled. Moscow has denied it, but clearly we expect that there will be Russians released. There have been Russians that Putin has eyed and has almost very clearly indicated that he would like to see released.
Bloomberg's Greg Sullivan. The Israeli military says it's confirmed that the head of Hamas's military wing was killed in an airstrike in Gaza in July. The news about Mohammed Dif comes a day after the assassination of the political chief of Hamas. Former President Trump raising some eyebrows after questioning Vice President Harris's racial identity before the National Association of Black Journalists.
She was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
She has always identified as a black woman.
I respect either one.
Trump's running mate J.D. Vance defended the former president's appearance at the convention in Chicago.
Unlike Kamala Harris, President Trump showed up and took some tough questions.
Well, J.D. Vance campaigned in Glendale, Arizona, and meanwhile, Harris responded.
Donald Trump spoke at the annual meeting of the National Association of Black Journalists. And it was the same old show. The divisiveness and the disrespect.
Harris campaigning there in Houston. At the Paris Games, in the overall medal count, the United States has 31 medals, France 26, and China has a total of 21. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it, with Bloomberg News Now. I'm John Tucker, and this is Bloomberg. Paul and Tom.
Can we do something light for 30 seconds? You know, it's been such an incredible news day with the earnings coming out tomorrow. The Washington Post has an important, Andrea Sachs, thank you so much. How do you get your dog into the United States once they leave? And it's like a huge deal.
Okay.
Like if we take Vet Bill to Paris, which you do, sure. The two kennel fee and Vet Bill in the River Seine, they're not going to swim in the river.
No.
But you got to bring them home, and it's not it's not routine. It's like a huge deal.
You got to get them quarantined or something?
Quarantine, rabies, the usual play.
All right.
Do they have visas or?
I don't think they have visas, but it's not a small matter, and that doesn't even include the business class ticket.
Oh, of course.
For each of them, you got to go in style, John.
As you always do, on our dime.
Well, Matt Miller had a first-class ticket for his big dog when he went to Germany.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Came back, Lufthansa made that happen.
Exactly.
Very good. Andrea Sachs, thank you so much at the Washington Post. Screen in the screen, elevated SPX up 0.7%. From New York City, Bloomberg surveillance. Good morning.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Stocks continue to rise after yesterday's Fed-fueled rally on Wall Street. The S&P 500 yet all 11 major industry groups up. Communication services in the lead, and that's home to where you'll find shares of Meta Platforms up over 9% after their earnings after the close of regular trading yesterday. Next up for the Mag 7 cohort of stocks, Apple and Amazon. That's coming after the close. Initial applications for U.S. unemployment benefits jumping to the highest level in almost a year. Of course, adding to evidence that the labor market is slowing and making another case for a September cut from the Fed. S&P 500 40 points higher, up 0.7%, 5561 of the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is up 82 points. That's a rise of 0.2%, 40,930. Now the Nasdaq 100, 140 points higher. That is up 0.75%. 2-year down 2 basis points, 422. The 10s down about 3. Right at 4%. We check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that is your Bloomberg Business Flash. Paul and Tom.
John Tucker, thanks so much. Paul Sweeney to drive things forward through the morning here. Is Alex in the building today?
Alex is here, absolutely.
Very good. Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney. And then on to earnings this afternoon. It's incredible. It has been a stunning 18 hours, and to our booking team and to our interns, thank you so much for really making it happen from the Fed meeting on. To have Bill Dudley with us, the former New York Fed president, in our studios. Richard Clarida, Anna Wong, I thought was brilliant today from Bloomberg Economics. And to have Louis DeLancer with us is really cool. We're glad that he's in the studio today as well. None of it matters. Even Louis DeLancer doesn't matter this morning, because our next guest is the single guest that all of you, coast to coast, care about. Dr. Hepp is the real deal, Paul, on the only thing that matters.
Selma Hepp joins us. She's a chief economist at CoreLogic. Let's talk residential real estate here. I don't know. I've got my Mortgage Bankers Association 30-year fixed rate, 6.82%. That's not enough to get people to say, I'm going to put my house on the market and find something new, is it?
No, it's absolutely not. I mean, housing market, when you look at all the other news happening today or recently, housing market is really boring still. It's been in a limbo for 3 years now after those 2 unprecedented pandemic years. So, I think mortgage rates are still governing what's going to happen. And with the prospect of falling mortgage rates, I think the momentum is building towards normalization. We are seeing inventories build up. We are seeing some unlocking of that. And so I think over the next couple of years, we'll see normalization.
Okay, your Maryland microeconomics. Let's go there right now. Supply and demand.
Yes.
Let's admit, the tri-state area is nuts. I mean, have you seen like Scarlett Fu up in Westchester?
Sure.
She's got like 8,000 square feet.
I know.
She could sell it. Somebody all cash would show up and buy the thing 1 hour after she listed it. But out in Denver, that's not happening because of multifamily and all that.
Yes.
Is there two Americas of stupid small supply and a huge glut?
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing huge geographical differences. I mean, over the last couple of years, we've seen geographical differences move around, but now it's between Southeast, where there's been a lot of new construction. There's additional issues there with homeowners insurance, with property taxes going up really rapidly, and so the markets there are really cooling. In New York, it's one of the or New York General, some of the strongest home price appreciation that we've seen. You know, it's really a lot of it catching up to overall cumulative appreciation from the onset of the pandemic that in those markets in the South we've seen a lot of, and not here, and so now we're catching up in many ways.
A lot of folks have been telling me there's just not enough housing in the United States. A, is that true? And B, how does that happen?
Well, it's a long story leading up to here, but you know what always surprises me is when I see news headlines saying, "Oh, inventory is up 30-40%." Oh my God, you know, but it's really still significantly below where we were pre-pandemic. So we are only approaching 1 million right now. Where we should be really at this point is 2 million, but what we really need is 4 million.
4 million new houses per.
Overall, I think that's where to make a dent in that supply and demand.
Are you based in Irvine? Are you up by LAX?
I'm in Los Angeles.
I was trying to act like I know what I'm talking about here. Are people really leaving California?
No.
Thank you. Explain this, because every newspaper, John Tucker, help me here. Every newspaper article tells me people in California are leaving to a low-tax state like New Jersey, and you're going to tell me no, they're not.
Well, if they were, we would see so much less appreciation that we're seeing. And, you know, in addition to Northeast, Southern California is one of the strongest appreciating markets still.
Then why are we telling people that we're exiting California? I don't get it.
I think, you know, there was a trend during the pandemic when some of the people were leaving, and there are people leaving, but they're not leaving enough to make a difference for the housing market. I think California is one of the most undersupplied markets, and so we have so many more people than supply. So that's really the issue in California.
Talk to me about Florida. I feel like things are gonna fall off the continental United States. So many people are moving down to Florida. Everybody I know is moving to Florida. Where are they living? Like, is there a housing shortage in southern Florida?
Well, that's an interesting one because the markets with most increase, like markets where the inventory is up back to pre-pandemic level, are in Florida.
Okay.
They've had so much new construction. I mean, 60% of new homes being built are in that spread between Texas and Florida.
That's crazy.
And so I think they don't have the same issues as we have in other parts.
All right, where's the mortgage rate that's going to clear it out? That's going to incent John Tucker to move out of his house to go down to some leisure village somewhere.
It'll have to be all cash. You can keep all the furniture and the kids too.
Is it a 6% mortgage, 5%, 4%? What's the? Where do you think we'll start clearing the market?
Right, it's $1 million question. Yep. So we've seen that at closer to 6% versus 7%. We see more people coming in. At this point, I don't know that inventories are that much driven by mortgage rates. You know, still we are 3% versus 6%. That's a huge difference, and plus 40+% increases in home prices. So that in itself is not going to make a difference. What we do have is 40% of homeowners that don't have a mortgage. Among baby boomers, that's 50 to 60%. And baby boomers are the major generation contributing to the inventory.
Do we need government policy? I mean, you do CoreLogic, Carl Case, Robert Schiller.
Yes.
Do we need a government policy to help the have-nots of housing?
Well, it's very difficult to enter the market for have-nots, and it's become so much so over the last few years. So I do think, especially in terms of down payments, you know, I think maybe people can afford that monthly mortgage payment, but coming up with down payment, it's very, very difficult.
Thank you for coming. John, do you want to ask about the taxes in New Jersey, the property taxes?
Just a surveillance correction. New Jersey does have the unenviable distinction of having the highest property taxes in the nation.
I didn't know that. You know, I wasn't aware of that as well.
So waiting for SALT.
Yep.
So are we going to see Washington take away the onerous burden that John Tucker faces?
I don't
The
think
salt
so.
tax.
Yes.
Salt
well, I'm in California
exemption.
too. Same issue. It would be
good.
very helpful for both of us.
Dr. Hepp, thank you so much. Selma Hepp with CoreLogic today. We're up 24 on the Dow fractional. SPX does better. NASDAQ does better, up 0.7%. Look this afternoon at the various Scarlet Fu properties for
Oh, boy. All over the
report
place.
on earnings. Apple's out. Amazon. Scarlett does the best earnings reports of anyone I've ever worked with, Paul.
Sure, I know.
I mean, I know,
Pro.
you know, I mean, you know, she's like actually like mental good. I
Yep,
mean, it's
exactly.
it's like a Scarlett. She's over in a cash flow statement.
She's also able to weave in celebrity news with the earnings.
It's
as
amazing.
well, which is
I
nobody
wonder,
can do that.
Should we have Scarlett in at 7 a.m. tomorrow so she can have a 16-hour day
Yeah.
to talk about Snoop Dogg and the Olympics? Because I'm sure she's all over that.
Exactly. We need
She
that kind of
says
report.
yes.
She says yes.
Nodding her head yes.
Good. It'll be a 16-hour day for Scarlet Fu. We'll have to see on that as well. Thank you to our team for an exceptional Thursday. It was the B-side of Moondance.
No.
It's August 1st. Van Morrison. Good morning, everyone.
Rain or shine, it was a cold wind in August. Shivers up and down my spine. I must stand in your light. In the